Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And this is David McCarricker with Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk about an article that Slavoj Žižek wrote, an article where he expressed some of his concerns about the recent election result in the United States. It's an article on his Substack, and it's titled From MAGA to Mega After Trump's Victory. And the subtitle is No, Everything is Not Going to Be Okay. So Dave's got it up on the screen. Dave, let's go through it. Let's kind of maybe even read through it a bit.
Yeah. Uh, I want to make a quick little aside here to the folks who are here in the live chat and the people who will be listening in the near future. We've got 24 live viewers. We've got quite a few people who've been subscribing to us on Spotify as well as on other podcast platforms. We've gained several new paid subscribers through Substack, and that allows them to access the B-sides. But also, we have a special playlist we can always share with people of the entire live streams that we do. Like, it's all of the ones, and I've shared that with my patrons. Benjamin can share that with anybody. Just reach out and ask us. This isn't something we're trying to hide, but we're trying somehow to not flood you all, and it's kind of a problem. For me, like, I don't want to send people a Substack notification every day, but it almost feels like we have so much stuff just coming out right now. But I don't know. We're blessed to have a lot of quality. And so there's a high quantity of high quality. But I think the Why Left episodes will probably sometimes not come out so frequently. But we're still in the aftermath of this election. The people in our lives are either uh, joyous or devastated, or let's be honest, the majority of them are indifferent. But in any of those three cases, I think that sort of galvanizes some kind of action on our part. Anything you want to say about any of that before we turn to the article, Benjamin?
Well, I'm just glad that people are here, and I welcome everybody who's following along, and I hope that we're fun. I hope that we do enough for you today.
100%. So from mega to mega after Trump's victory. No, everything is not going to be okay. Slavoj Žižek. This is from his Substack, Žižek Goads and Prods. He does not post these himself. There's a guy in England he works with who posts all of this stuff. Just saying that so that you're not trying to DM Slavoj on here. It's not going to work. He says, where does Trump's victory leave whatever remains of the left? In 1922, when the Bolsheviks had to retreat into the new economic policy of allowing a much wider scope for the market economy and private property, Lenin wrote a short text on ascending a high mountain. He uses the simile of a climber who has to retreat back to the 0 point, to the ground from his first attempt to reach a new mountain peak, in order to describe how one retreats without opportunistically betraying one's fidelity to the cause. Communists who do not give way to despondency and who preserve their strength and flexibility to begin from the beginning over and over again in approaching an extremely difficult task, are not doomed. This is Lenin at his Beckettian best, echoing the line from Worstward Ho: try again, fail better. Such a Leninist approach is needed more than ever today, when communism is needed more than ever as the only way to confront the challenges we face: ecology, war, AI. But when whatever remains of the left is less and less able to mobilize people around a viable alternative. With Trump's victory, the left reached its 0 point. I just want to say, for people just joining, for people who've never followed anything that we've done here, or just to remind folks who've already listened to the previous episodes, the converdiction that sort of frames the the roles that we're playing here is between some kind of post left or something other than left, like we need to be searching for something beyond it. which is more or less my position, as opposed to a no, what we need to do is reconstitute the left. This would be the more Studebakerian approach. So that's a fun one, Benjamin. The question then about the left is absolutely crucial for what Slavoj is doing here and the overall theme of today's conversation. I think a good title for it would be What Remains of the Left. He seems to be saying that communism and the left are the same thing, but that's fascinating because he's also going to say down below at some point, and this is kind of why we gathered you all here today, that Biden is the most leftist candidate since FDR, which is not something Slavoj came up with on his own. It's been being passed around for a while. Vosh was saying it not too long ago. I think he was saying it for the last several years, in fact. And so it's interesting.
It goes back to a historian, Gary Gersel, said this back when Biden was first elected, said that Biden was going to reconstitute the spirit of FDR in the Democratic Party. And because Gersel argued that, and he's a quite significant historian, a lot of people hopped onto that. It's part of the hi historian here. Let me tell you what the present means based on my knowledge of history.
Okay. Well, we should probably read that one sometime as well. That'd be a lot of fun. But this question of the left, it's one that recently somebody brought up a question. It's a really good question about in the chat saying, you know, hey, have you guys read Kolakowski's piece on the concept of the left? And I think that is itself deserving of an entire episode because Kolakowski's definition of the left seems to be the one that Chris Catrone rolls with, Platypus rolls with. According to Chris Bhaskara over at, is it Jacobin, right? Sankara, he's drawing from this notion of the left as articulated by Kolakowski. So definitely something that we'll want to get back to. I'm just throwing this out here because, folks, we do pay attention to your comments, and we will eventually do entire episodes about everything that you guys bring up. So,
yeah, we're just a little focused right now on stuff which is directly connected to the election, which recently took place, but we will do all kinds of stuff in due course. No worries.
Yep. Before we plunge ourselves into platitudes about Trump's triumph, we should note some important details. First among them being the fact that Trump did not get more votes than in the 2020 election where he lost against Biden. It was Kamala who lost around 10 million votes compared to Biden. So it's not that Trump won big, it's Kamala who lost. And all leftist critics of Trump should begin with radical self-criticism. Among the points to be noted is the unpleasant fact that immigrants, especially from Latin countries, are almost inherently conservative. They came to the U.S. not to change it, but to succeed in the system. Or as Todd McGowan put it, they want to create a better life for themselves and their family, not to better their social order. And by the way, this is the first time, I believe, in history that Slavoj Žižek spelled Todd McGowan's name correctly, which is a big deal because they're friends. Their friendship goes back very far, but no one's ever been sure if it's an inside joke. Even Todd has been confused about this, but the tendency has been for Slavoj, even in his final published works, like Less Than Nothing, to spell McGowan with an A in there, MacGowan. And we want to shout out Todd. Todd's a good friend of Theory Underground. He just taught a course here over the summer. And his podcast, Why Theory, is almost like a spiritual cousin of a lot of the stuff that we do. So we'll keep going. This is why I don't think Kamala's lost because she is a non-white woman. Remember that 2 weeks ago, Kemi Badenoch, a black woman, was triumphantly elected as the new leader of the British Conservatives. I see the main reason for her defeat in the fact that Trump stood for politics. He and his followers acted as engaged politicians, while Kamala stood for non-politics. Many of Kamala's positions were quite acceptable: healthcare, abortion. However, Trump and his partisans repeatedly made clear extreme statements, while Kamala excelled in avoiding difficult choices, offering empty platitudes. In this respect, Kamala is close to Keir Starmer in the UK. Just recall how she avoided taking a clear stance on the Gaza war, losing votes not only from radical Zionists, but also from many young Black and Muslim voters.
I think she did take a clear stance. It was just clearly a continuation of the present stance. When she suggested that people who were complaining about the administration's policy were implicitly helping Trump, she made it very clear that she wasn't going to change the policy. I think that was quite clear. I also think it's strange for Slavo to say that Kamala's position on healthcare is acceptable. I don't think most Americans in the American left would feel that way about it. But it's not his country. I don't know how much he is following or is centering the Medicare for All stuff.
There are so many questions I have about some of the implicit frames in this piece, especially the ways he's using communist and leftist and conservative to make it so that leftist and communist are like this one thing on this spectrum, and that conservatism is just the opposite. Like, it basically makes it impossible to be a conservative leftist, or to be I just don't understand, honestly. It's like, if you want to talk about leftism, then you have to talk about the right. But conservatism is something different altogether.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more as we go. For now, I do want to point out, I think he's right to make this point about Badenoch. Badenoch became the leader of the Conservative Party because people on the right are perfectly willing to support women and minority candidates. It's completely horseshit to claim that they aren't willing to do that. Very clearly they are. In the UK and many other countries all over the world, the right has supported women and minority candidates. And so Žižek is quite right to raise this point here. Badenoch is a Black woman, and they have no problem at all with making her leader of the Conservative Party.
All right, let's see here. So yeah, he's saying that Kamala stood for non-politics, though, and that Trump at least stood for politics, right? What Democrats failed to learn from Trumpians is that in a passionate political battle, extremism works. In her concession speech, Kamala said, "To the young people who are watching, it is okay to feel sad and disappointed, but please know it's going to be okay." No, everything is not going to be okay. We should not trust future history. We should not trust future history will somehow restore balance. With Trump's victory, the trend that brought close to power the new populist right in many European countries reached its climax. Kamala was designated by Trump as worse than Biden, not just a socialist, but even a communist. To confuse her stance with communism is a sad index of where we are today, a confession clearly discernible in another often heard populist claim: the people are tired of far-left rule. An absurdity if there ever was one. New populists designate the still hegemonic liberal order as far left. No, this order is not far left. It is simply the progressive liberal center, which is much more interested in fighting whatever remains of the left than fighting the new right. If what we have now in the West is far left rule, then von der Leyen must be a Marxist communist, as Viktor Orban effectively claims. Could you explain?
She's one of the leading figures in the European Union, if you don't know.
Okay. I'm jotting down a couple notes here about stuff to come back to, but this idea of extremism is something that could have worked to Kamala's. I'll want to come back to that. Yeah, I think I think there's a case to be made that some kind of economic populism was called for, but what we did have was progressive extremism. It just wasn't economic populist in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it was the opposite. It was anti-populist. All right. Kamala, wait.
There is a notion potentially of an extreme center. To be able to talk about what that would mean, I think can open people up a little bit to some different ways of thinking about politics. But the idea of an extreme center is, I think, an interesting concept.
Yeah. The new populist right treats communism and corporate capitalism as one and the same. But the true identity of opposites resides elsewhere. About 8 or so years ago, I was criticized for saying that Trump is a pure liberal. How could I ignore that Trump is a dictatorial fascist? My critics missed the point. Perhaps the best characterization of Trump is that he is liberal, namely a liberal fascist, which is ultimate proof that liberalism and fascism work together. By the way, he's like uppercasing fascist but not liberal. He's uppercasing communism and right. He's uppercasing socialist. He's been doing that throughout this piece. And so I think that's kind of interesting and worthy of note for those who are just listening.
Yes, he's using the concept of liberalism more broadly than these other concepts, and he wants you to be aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Namely, a liberal fascist, which is ultimate proof that liberalism and fascism work together. They are both sides of the same coin. Trump is not just authoritarian. His dream is also to allow the market to function freely at its most destructive, from brutal profiteering to dismissing all ethical limitations in public media against sexism and racism as a form of socialism. We should begin with a critique of Trump's opponents. Boris Budin rejected the predominant interpretation that sees the rise of the new rightist populism as a regression caused by the failure of modernization. For Budin, religion as a political force is an effect of the post-political disintegration of society, of the dissolution of traditional mechanisms that guaranteed stable communal links. Fundamentalist religion is not only political, it is politics itself, as in it sustains the space for politics. Even more poignantly, it is no longer just a social phenomenon, but the very texture of society, so that in a way, society itself becomes a religious phenomenon. This is thus no longer possible. It is thus no longer possible to distinguish the purely spiritual aspect of religion from its politicization. In a post-political universe, religion is the predominant space in which antagonistic passions return. What happened recently in the guise of religious fundamentalism is thus not the return of religion in politics, but simply the return of the political as such. So the true question is, why did the political in the radical secular sense, the great achievement of European modernity, lose its formative power? So is he just defining the political as antagonism?
Well, I think here he's setting up some different interpretations of the race that he intends to position himself in relation to. So this is the Budin interpretation. Then we'll have the Goldman interpretation. And he's using these people as ideal types to describe particular ways of interfacing. So here, for Budin, it's a framing that treats the election as religious primarily, as about the return of politics in religion, or the inability of politics to subsist without religion, that in some way that this has something to do with the return of religion or return of the latently political character of religion. And then in this next paragraph, it's going to be a discussion of the economy. And then I suppose we're going to get to a point here in this piece where Žižek is going to try to complicate these different positions. Maybe he'll put them together. Maybe he'll offer an alternative. That's where I'm expecting it to go.
Cool. Okay, yeah. David Goldman commented on the result with, "It's the economy, stupid," but as he added, not in a direct way. The main indicators show that under Biden, the economy was doing rather well, although inflation hit hard for the majority of poor people. The trend toward a greater gap between poor and rich has been a global tendency in the West for the last 30 years. Yes, higher prices for everyday products, especially food, higher rents, and medical costs pushed millions toward poverty. However, Biden was definitely the most leftist president after FDR, as yeah, FD Roosevelt in his economic policies, and did a lot for workers, women's, and students' rights. Inflation is thus not enough to explain the mystery. Why did a considerable majority perceive their economic predicament as dire? Here, ideology enters the scene, and David McCarricker wants to punch Slavoj Žižek straight in the face.
It's pure ideology.
I'm sorry. I'm exaggerating, but I was one of many people, especially here at Theory Underground, who was pretty put off by this idea that we're merely perceiving our economic predicament as dire. Like, that's kind of just PMC gaslighting.
Yeah. So I think that this is entirely inaccurate. However, I think that many Europeans have a perception of what the Biden administration is doing that's coming from European media, which has acted as if the Biden administration has taken very dramatic radical action. And when I talk to people, whatever European country they're from, the UK, Germany, wherever, this tends to be the perception. It's in part because of the way European media covers American politics. And it's also because the European Union reacted to the COVID crisis in an even weaker way, such that by comparison, the Biden administration's activity looks vigorous. It's because the Europeans have such weak response to the Euro crisis and to COVID that they look at America and see a vibrant industrial policy. But I think in terms of American history, it would not at all amount to that. But I don't expect Europeans, particularly for whom English is a second language or a third language or a fourth language, to necessarily be entirely on point with regard to the details of American history and the level of American industrial policy that used to exist, which completely dwarfs what the Biden administration did. So that would be my qualified defense of why I could imagine someone like Žižek might in good faith make this kind of comment. The unfortunate thing is that lots of Americans who do live in this country and profess some familiarity with its history also make the same kinds of claims.
I'm just like thinking about how expensive basic groceries have gotten. And it's just...
Yeah, it's about a 25% difference versus before Biden across the board. Now, that's not to say that the current inflation rate is that high, but people don't just vote based on the current inflation rate. They vote based on their sense of how things have changed over the course of the presidency to a point. And certainly people are going to notice if the price of goods and services is 20 or 25% higher than it was before the president took office. And there's only so much you can do by arguing, hey, the rate is now down to 3%. That's not going to change the way people look at the sticker when they're in the supermarket. People remember that. And this is high inflation. Any period of high inflation, no matter how brief, tends to have a very devastating effect on the odds of the party in power getting reelected, which we know from political science research. It's very, very difficult to convince people that they should reelect a party after there's been a period of higher than 5% inflation for any length of time in the United States, any length of time. So I would anticipate that Žižek probably would not be familiar with some of that research that exists. And I think many people, even in political science, have tried to downplay that because they think it's politically inconvenient. But we do know that a period of high inflation is almost always very bad for incumbent administrations, even if they manage to get the inflation rate down subsequently during the term, because it destroys confidence in the ability of the government to manage the economy. But let's hear what he has to say about ideology.
We're not talking here just about ideology in terms of ideas and guiding principles, but ideology in a more basic sense, how political discourse functions as a social link. Aaron Schuster observed that Trump is an over-present leader whose authority is based on his own will and who openly disdains knowledge. It is this rebellious anti-systemic theater that serves as the point of identification for the people. This is why Trump's serial insults and outright lies, not to mention the fact that he is a convicted criminal, work for him. Trump's ideological triumph resides in the fact that his followers experience their obedience to him as a form of subversive resistance. Or as Todd McGowan put it, one can support the fledgling fascist leader in an attitude of total obedience while feeling oneself to be utterly radical, which is a position designed to maximize the enjoyment factor almost de facto.
And there's a premise here about fascism being the relevant signifier. And back before, Žižek was defending himself against people who argued that he had failed to recognize Trump as a fascist. So his response was simply to concede that point, or to claim that it was a point that he always already had in fact adopted, that Trump was a liberal fascist and that liberalism and fascism were simply linked.
Right.
There really isn't an attempt here to engage with arguments that fascism is not the appropriate way of thinking about what this is.
No.
That really hasn't come into this piece. Certainly lots of people, including many people in the academy, have made the argument that fascism is not the appropriate category. Even people like, say, Samuel Moyn at Yale, a liberal academic, has made the argument that fascism is not the appropriate category. So that's just not what he's engaging with here. He's engaging with critics who are to his left, who argued that he was giving aid and comfort to the fascists by not explicitly calling Trump a fascist.
And one could even, and this is how I often read Slavoy's more public works, he's speaking as one does, right? He knows who his audience is, and he's speaking as one does. In hardcore theory land, he does not always do this thing, in such simplistic terms, where he's speaking as though his audience is the Guardian reader, right? Like that's so. I always. This is part of the reason I don't tend to read his public articles, is because he's often just engaging in the discourse, using people's words the way that people use the words, but without really clarifying them or nailing them down, So Benjamin's been able to tease out a lot from little nuances, like what's being uppercased and what's not, right? But yeah, we'll get into the whole fascism thing later. I'll keep reading.
Yeah.
So here we should mobilize Freud's notion of theft of enjoyment, and others' enjoyment inaccessible to us, women's enjoyment for men, another's ethnic group's enjoyment for our group, or our rightful enjoyment stolen from us by an other or threatened by an other. Russell Sprigula noticed how this dimension of theft of enjoyment played a crucial role when Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Could there possibly be a better exemplification of the logic of theft of enjoyment than the mantra that Trump supporters were chanting while storming the Capitol? Stop the steal. The hedonistic, carnivalesque nature of storming the Capitol to stop the steal wasn't merely incidental to the attempted insurrection, insofar as it was all about taking back enjoyment, supposedly stolen from them by others, as in blacks, Mexicans, Muslims, LGBTQ+, etc., which Carnival was absolutely essential to it.
Just briefly on this point, I find it very interesting that this piece assumes that that those who have stolen the enjoyment have to be racialized or treated in religious or in terms of sexuality. There's a premise here about Trump supporters hating groups of people, when it might be that they are directing this at elites or bureaucrats. They might have a different way of conceptualizing it altogether, and that's been excluded here. There's a kind of false appearance of options, right? Blacks, Mexicans, Muslims, LGBTQ+, but all of these options are identity groups.
Right.
What if the one that has stolen the enjoyment is the bureaucrat or is the elite administrator? That way of thinking is just not taken seriously. And it is a quite common way of thinking among his base.
I love Y Theory. I love Todd McGowan, Slavoj Žižek, and Russ Sprigula, we met up with him on tour. We had a great breakfast. Sprigula's the man. He really is a great guy. But it really is like all of them. They just watch MSNBC, listen to NPR, read The New Yorker and The Guardian, and then they do Hegel and Lacan and a little bit of Marx. And it's like, guys,
some of that's generational, and some of it is also, the work that they do, the places where they live, who's around. Like you are out in Idaho and I'm out in Indiana, and we meet different kinds of people more often than they do.
Yeah, the idea that it's just like the people who were storming the Capitol were these people who were like, oh, it's black people, oh, it's Mexicans, oh, it's Muslims, oh, it's gay people. That to me just seems patently absurd and worthy of like actually laughing at. Like, it should be called out. It should be stopped in its tracks. This is the standard liberal left progressive. Oh, look, they scapegoat. Bitch, you're scapegoating right here. You're scapegoating.
Yes, this is scapegoating the scapegoaters, which ultimately serves the same system, because what the system wants us to do is to scapegoat each other and not cooperate.
Yeah. And I also know that if we were to say, no, PMC globalists would have been a much bigger target here, then people say, oh, you just mean the Jews? Because NPR brain syndrome has, made that a pervasive idea that you can't have a problem with globalism without really, you're just talking about the Jews. It's absolutely deranged.
Well, in the 90s, when people used the term globalization, that was considered a left critique. It's, really, in many cases, globalization and globalism refer to the same thing, but one is left-coded and the other is right-coded.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that that's the case absolutely across the board. And I wouldn't say that absolutely none of the January 6 guys were thinking in terms of blacks, Mexicans, Muslims, LGBTQ plus. There may have been some.
There were a couple. Yeah.
But this is not the dominant mode of thinking on the right in the United States.
No.
The dominant mode of thinking on the right is to do with bureaucrats, administrators, and the international system. Objections to the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations. These are the organizations that really aggravate these guys. The World Economic Forum.
Right.
These are the things that tick them off. But there's no serious engagement with it. But it's presumed that the audience also doesn't seriously engage with it. So there's no need to engage with it because the audience doesn't engage, the people writing don't engage. So there's never any contact point with it.
100%. We're the closest point of contact with it that they would probably ever make. But what happened on January 6, 2021 at the Capitol was not a coup attempt, but a carnival. The idea that carnival can serve as a model for progressive protest movements. Such protests are carnivalesque, not only in their form and atmosphere, theatrical performances, humorous chants, but also in their non-centralized organization, is deeply problematic. Is late capitalist social reality itself not already carnivalesque? Was Kristallnacht in 1938, this half-organized, half-spontaneous outburst of violent attacks on Jewish homes, synagogues, businesses, and people, not a carnival if ever there was one? Furthermore, is carnival not also the name for the obscene underside of power, from gang rapes to mass lynchings? Let us not forget that Mikhail Bakhtin developed his notion of carnival in his book on Rebellis, written in the 1930s as a direct reply to Stalinist purges.
Well, I think comparing January 6th to Kristallnacht is entirely unreasonable. I don't think there's any basis for defending that comparison.
No. Could you give us your take on why that is, while I try to find
Because Kristallnacht very explicitly targeted Jews, very explicitly, overwhelmingly so. It wasn't just that some of the people participating in Kristallnacht may have had anti-Semitic motivation. It's that the whole point of Kristallnacht was to target a particular group of people. That's not what was going on January 6th.
Right.
Now, in the earlier part of this, where he compares January 6th to what progressive protest movements do, I think there is something to that comparison. But I would not compare the Black Lives Matter demonstrations to Kristallnacht. That would also be a completely unreasonable point of comparison. I would, however, compare some of the demonstrations that progressive liberals engage in to January 6th. If a bunch of students occupy a university building, that's usually deemed an occupation. Now, the people who are in the university building who work for the university might be scared senseless by those kids. They might actually think that the kids might hurt them, and they might be genuinely very scared. But if the president of Yale were to come before you and go, these students were terrifying me, they were menacing me, most people on the left would not take that seriously and would not treat that as a serious complaint. They would go, well, why don't you do something about their demands and grievances? Yet, if the coding is reversed, people treat it entirely differently. Really, we ought to think of what student demonstrations do more like January 6th, and we ought to think of January 6th more like, student demonstrations and Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They have a lot more in common. There's usually a small minority interested in violence or interested in a disturbance that has ill motivation, and the majority of people involved are trying to do something good as they understand it. And that's the case with all of these different protests, whether they're left-coded or right-coded. Most of the people there think they're there to do something which, if you took them seriously, would be a positive thing.
Yeah, could you, I guess I wanted to ask you this anyway, and we might as well do it here. I don't know, we're probably halfway through the article at this point, but I wanted to add, maybe more, I don't know. But I wanted to ask you about what you think of this popular sort of response to acting like the Capitol siege was the worst thing since the Civil War, the worst assault on our democracy since the Civil War. The popular comeback is, what about the 7 months of looting and rioting that was being encouraged by the blues, right? Like the Democrats in the United States were encouraging the BLM rioting and looting.
I mean, in both cases, you had an exaggeration of what was going on by the television media, which had a ton of money to make from pretending that there was an enormous amount of violence occurring, when really, in both cases, it was significantly more muted than partisans on either side think. That's not to say that there was no destruction of property during BLM, and it's not to say that none of the people involved in January 6th had bad intentions. In both cases, there was some of each of those things, but not nearly to the degree to which the partisan media portrayed it. In both cases, most of the people involved were trying to do something good as they understood it. And this is something that has been really lost on people. When we start talking about the Kristallnacht, we're talking about deliberate targeting of a group. There is no defense for something like that. That's really of a completely different order and kind from demonstrating against an election result that you think may have occurred in a fraudulent way, right? Where you think that perhaps bureaucrats or something have conspired in some way to take away what would have been an electoral victory for your side. Very different from that. It's also very different from demonstrating to try to protect Black Americans from the police, or to try to protect American citizens more generally from the police, from police brutality. Those are both very different objectives from Kristallnacht. It's just completely inappropriate to compare either of those things to Kristallnacht. They are better compared to each other than either is to Kristallnacht.
Yeah, and the common theme,
or certainly to the American Civil War. I mean, for one, the most obvious instance of serious, nastiness that would come to my mind since the American Civil War would be something like the crushing of the bonus army demonstrators by the tanks in the 30s, when these bonus army protesters came asking for an early bonus because the Depression had unemployed many of them. And the government became convinced that they were communists, even though this was not the case. And Douglas MacArthur, who was then in a more junior position than he subsequently acquired during World War II, decided to bulldoze their camp with tanks. And the Hoover administration was not really properly informed and had to act after the fact as if it had been informed from the beginning in the decision. And of course, Hoover and MacArthur then claimed they were communists and tried to use that to excuse what they had done. But they ran over World War I veterans with tanks and crushed them with tanks. in Washington, D.C. That was the most brutal act of violence in terms of, anything going on in D.C. that's occurred in a very, very long time, but it's completely memory hold by people. Anyway, I digress. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I think the unifying factor between the Capitol siege and the BLM unrest and general movement, the part of it that was grassroots, not the part of it that was co-opted and sort of being astroturfed, arguably from the beginning, but there's always real people involved, right? And I would say that the connecting factor across all of the real people involved is living in post-trust times. Post-trust times are the age of institutions having lost legitimacy, right? And
this is a great point, Dave. Yeah, the loss of the trust in the police, echoing the loss of the trust in the electoral process. Yeah. It's ordinary people not trusting the people that they previously in other generations would have trusted. If the police tell you that they have to use force, in previous generations, people would have believed them. And if the government said this was the result of the election, in previous generations, people would have believed them. And I think for some of the older folks here, there is this need instead to make comparisons with 20th century events that occurred during an entirely different context. And it's just really a total anachronism to take anything that's happened lately in the States and connect it to Kristallnacht. Or to the Stalinist purges, for that matter.
The contrast between Trump's official ideological message, conservative values, and the style of his public performance, saying more or less whatever pops into his head, insulting others and violating all rules of good manners, tells a lot about our predicament. What kind of world do we live in where bombarding the public with indecent vulgarities presents itself as the last barrier to protect us from the triumph of a society in which everything is permitted and old values go down the drain? As Alenka Zupancic puts it, Trump is not a relic of old moral majority conservatism. He is, to a much greater degree, the caricatured, inverted image of postmodern, permissive society itself, a product of this society's own antagonisms and inner limitations. By the way, we will be bringing her on for the Epic Marathon stream on the 20th of this month. November 20th, 2024 at Theory Underground for the M-Stew. We're going to be talking to Alenka about her new book called Disavowal, and we'll be bringing on Jacob from TUCon as a guest co-host and interviewer. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, that's fascinating. I think that's an interesting quote. I'll be interested to see what Alenka has to say.
Yeah, we might get into this as well. It'd be good. It'd be cool to kind of pick her brains about the election. Yeah.
I don't know if it'll go there, but in any case, seems like an interesting person to have on.
Yeah. I think there's got to be something to it, though, that, Trump, obviously he's not part of the old moral majority conservatism. He's obviously something new. To say that he's the inverted image of postmodern permissive society itself is really interesting. Permissive.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
I've often liked to do a kind of Trump as Constantine versus Trump as Aurelian, thing. Which Roman emperor do you think of Trump as if you're someone who gravitates toward him as the charismatic authority figure? Trump as Constantine is this unwitting Christian. He's someone who may not have Christian beliefs himself, may not have virtues himself, but nonetheless furthers Christian goals and objectives, right? Whereas Aurelian in Roman history is the restitutor orbis, the restorer of the world, the one who flies around the Roman Empire, putting down all of the rebellions and smashing all of the splinter states and putting back together the territory, all underneath the banner of the unconquered sun. He's this very pagan and very flashy emperor who has one term in which he does he reigns for a period of time which is about equivalent to a presidential term and flies around doing all kinds of things. I think Trump supporters are divided between people who want Trump to be this Constantine figure who unwittingly does something for old moral majority conservatism, and on the other hand, people who see him as a pagan restitutor orbis who is meant to recreate the 50s, but without all of the restraints, without all the cultural baggage, a postmodern 50s.
That's a killer contrast. I love that. Yeah, because often people will be like, is it Caesar? Is it Napoleon? You're like, no, man, there's a bunch of other emperors, actually.
We could have fun with lots of other historical comparisons that are vaguely anachronistic and yet do say something. And I emphasize vaguely anachronistic because I'm not literally saying I think Trump's like a Roman emperor. I think that we'll continue to have competitive multi-party elections, guys. I'm not concerned about the fate of democracy, at least as it's been understood historically in the United States, as competitive multi-party elections without necessarily a whole lot else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now he's just got a banger ass lineup of people he's shouting out throughout this piece, because he's gone through McGowan and Sprigula,
which is something he does very well. I mean, he's done this for you guys. One thing even when we disagree with Žižek, he does a fabulous job shouting out people and drawing attention to people who have had less of a public profile than him. It's one of the things he does that is very kind and sweet. So even when we disagree with him, I appreciate this about his character.
Yeah, we do love that about him, as well as other things like his sense of humor and his
and willing to tolerate people who disagree with him and nonetheless shout them out.
And his approach to theory at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Adrian Johnston proposed a complementary twist on Jacques Lacan's dictum, according to which repression is always the return of the repressed. The return of the repressed sometimes is the most effective repression. Is this not also a concise definition of Trump? As Freud said about perversion, in it, everything that was repressed, all repressed content, comes out in all its obscenity. But this return of the repressed only strengthens the repression. This is also why there is nothing liberating in Trump's obscenities. They merely strengthen social oppression and mystification. Trump's obscene performances thus express the falsity of his populism. To put it with brutal simplicity, while acting as if he cares for ordinary people, he promotes big capital. Now, on that latter point, I think that's indisputable, but I just want to point out, like, hearing Slavoj refer to his performances as obscene, to me, it feels like he has a twinkle in his eye, like he's got to be joking, like nothing that Trump's ever said or done is really that obscene. Like and that Slavoj is much more obscene than Trump in some ways. Like it's just,
well, it is obscene relative to what American political culture was 20 years ago.
Okay.
Right. It violates a lot of norms and taboos that used to exist. I could take that. I agree with the point that he promotes big capital, but I do think it's an interesting shift to go from him violating cultural and social taboos to saying that this is about economic repression. I would take it a little bit more literally than this. I think that one of the effects of Trump is to promote the woke by creating a situation in which progressive liberals feel endangered and therefore make an effort to defend institutionally their values. There is a back and forth here which tends to intensify cultural antagonism and lead to more censorship. I think being anti-woke, oftentimes wokeness is nonetheless strengthened, promoted. That would be the direction I would take that. Although I do think there is a point to be made here about the economy, I would make that point differently. And I would make it more in relation to global and supranational structures and the ways in which those supervene upon Trump's policies in the economic arena, specifically the tariffs. But anyway, let's keep going.
How can we account for the strange fact that Donald Trump, a lewd and destitute person, the very opposite of Christian decency, can function as the chosen hero of Christian conservatives? The explanation one usually hears is that while Christian conservatives are well aware of Trump's problematic personality, they have chosen to ignore this side of things, since what really matters to them is Trump's agenda, especially his anti-abortion stance. Which is, by the way, crazy to even say, because he's the least anti-abortion candidate that the Republican Party has ever had.
This is from the previous cycle. Right? If you appoint him, you'll get the Federalist Society judges and they'll overturn Roe. That turned out to be true.
Oh,
so
okay.
From the point of view of 2016, that argument held weight with a lot of people. More recently, there have been social conservatives who have protested against Trump at the Republican convention, who have been upset with some of the new positions that the party has taken, which they regard as moderating the traditionally socially conservative stances. But what Žižek, I think, really is drawing on here is a set of arguments that were made back in 2016.
Okay, good job. If he succeeds in naming conservative new members to the Supreme Court who will then overturn Roe v. Wade, then this act will obliterate all his sins. But are things as simple as that? What if the very duality of Trump's personality, his high moral stance accompanied by personal lewdness and vulgarities, is what makes him attractive to Christian conservatives? What if they secretly identify with this very duality? This doesn't mean that we should take too seriously the images that abound in our media of a typical Trumpian as an obscene fanatic. No, the large majority of Trump voters are everyday people who appear decent and talk in a normal, common, rational way. I like how he says they appear decent. It is as if they externalize their madness and obscenity in Trump. A couple of years ago, Trump was unflatteringly compared to a man who noisily defecates in the corner of a room where a high-class drinking party is going on. But it is easy to see that the same holds for many leading politicians around the globe. Was Erdogan not defecating in public when in a paranoid outburst he dismissed critics of his policy towards the Kurds as traitors and foreign agents? Was Putin not defecating in public when in a well-calculated public vulgarity aimed at boosting his popularity at home, he threatened a critic of his Chechen politics with medical castration? Not to mention Boris Johnson, ... This coming...
Here, just briefly, it is quite striking that he's chosen to equate Johnson and Trump, leaders of first world states, rich states in the West, with Erdogan and Putin, who lead states that are much poorer with much weaker democratic institutions, both historically and recently. Very different kinds of countries being leaders being equated here together on the basis of rhetoric, on the basis of things they say in public. Just rhetoric as the basis of that equation. But these are very different states with very different institutions.
What's the stakes of kind of focusing on the rhetoric, this sort of shared rhetoric between these countries that are so different?
Yeah. It decontextualizes these leaders. It allows you to say, well, if he talks like somebody who leads a very different kind of state, then that implies he'll govern the way that person governs in that other institutional context where the procedures operate in a very different way. And if you're someone who doesn't know how the Turkish state works or how the Russian state works, if you're not someone who's very up to it on international politics, this can be very misleading. I think it's very misleading to say that if two leaders talk the same way or have a similar rhetorical style, then that means they can govern in the same way or will govern in the same way. I think that's a sleight of hand. That's not to offer any defense of any of these people. It's just, this is not very precise argument.
This coming open of the obscene background of our ideological space, to put it somewhat simply, the fact that we can now more and more openly make racist, sexist statements, which until recently belonged to private space, does not mean that mystification has ended or that ideology now openly displays its cards. On the contrary, when obscenity penetrates the public scene, ideological mystification is at its strongest. The true political, economic, and ideological stakes are more invisible than ever. Public obscenity is always sustained by concealed moralism. Its practitioners secretly believe they are fighting for a cause, and it is at this level that they should be attacked. Remember how many times liberal media announced that Trump was caught with his pants down and had committed public suicide, mocking the parents of a dead war hero, boasting about pussy grabbing, etc. Arrogant liberal commentators were shocked at how their continuous acerbic attacks on Trump's vulgar, racist, and sexist outbursts, factual inaccuracies, economic nonsense, etc., did not hurt him at all, but maybe even enhanced his popular appeal. They missed how identification works. We usually identify with others' weaknesses, not only or even principally with their strengths, so the more Trump's limitations were mocked, the more ordinary people identified with him and perceived attacks on him as condescending attacks on themselves. It's probably one of my favorite things that he says in this article. Definitely, I guess, like the thing that stuck with me after I initially read it, as I was going about my day for the next couple of days, I kept thinking about this because it's like he's saying something that I've tried to articulate in a lot of different ways with a lot of people who think that making fun of someone's faux pas is a real inroad with anyone who disagrees with you, when that's ridiculous. If you have some kind of a imaginary symbolic relation to someone, you feel some kind of affectionate way for them, and then you see somebody making fun of them, even if they actually did slip up or do something ridiculous, it endears you to them. And for me, like, I liked Louis C.K. I always liked him. He's a funny guy. But it was him getting canceled that made me really like him. Like, it, and this has worked with a lot of cancellations. Most of the people that I like were canceled before I really started paying attention to their work, because it humanizes them. Oh, look, they're a human. So, yeah.
This is why I provocatively thought the effort to get rid of Biden could have been very good ultimately for Biden had he managed to stick it out, because it would have put him in opposition to all these elite, pretentious, nasty people who were saying he couldn't run. And that would have given him something potentially on the basis of which people could identify with. I talked to a lot of people in the Midwest who were seeing their grandparents who are put upon and constantly accused of not being able to handle things, right, in him. So yes, I think this is a good point. I think it's a good point, both the way Žižek puts it, and anyone who is familiar with some of the previous instances in Europe of this kind of politics, say Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, could tell you that, yeah, this kind of trying to scandalize them is not at all an effective strategy.
Yeah. Remember how many times? Wait, nope, I already read that. Where are we? We're like right in the middle here.
The subliminal message. Yeah. Right
the
there.
subliminal message to ordinary people from Trump's vulgarities was, "I am one of you." Meanwhile, ordinary Trump supporters felt constantly humiliated by the liberal elite's patronizing attitude towards them. As Alenka Zupancic some succinctly put it, the extremely poor do the fighting for the extremely rich, as was clear in Trump's election victory. And what does the left do? Little more than scold and insult them, or worse still, patronizingly understand their confusion and blindness. This liberal left arrogance this left liberal arrogance, uppercase left, lowercase liberal, liberal left liberal arrogance explodes at its purest in political comedy talk shows, Jon Stewart, John Oliver, which mostly enact pure arrogance from liberal intellectual elites. 100%. 100%. Every bread tuber is just trying to be a DIY Jon Stewart or John Oliver, and they don't realize how much these guys actually are a big part of the problem. As Stephen March put it in LA Times, parodying Trump is at best a distraction from his real politics. At worst, it converts all politics into a gag. The process has nothing to do with performers or writers or their choices. Trump built his candidacy on performing as a comic heel. That has been his pop culture persona for decades. It is simply not possible to parody effectively a man who is a conscious self-parody and who became president based on that performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really
think is very true.
I love that point. It's a really important point. Yeah. It just does, guys, come on. Yeah, it's like everybody parodying Trump has been this. It's like if they're not fact checking him, they're parodying him. And it's like both of those things do not work. In my past work, I used a joke from really existing socialism popular among dissidents. In the 15th century Russia occupied by Mongols, a farmer and his wife walk along a dusty road. A Mongol warrior on horseback stops beside them and tells the farmer he will now rape his wife. He then adds, but since there's so much dust on the ground, you should hold my testicles while I'm raping your wife so they don't get dirty. I guess I should have pushed this button.
Trigger warning.
After finishing his job and riding away, the farmer starts laughing and jumping with joy. His surprised wife asks, how can you be jumping with joy when I was just brutally raped? The farmer answers, but I got him. His balls are full of dust. This sad joke tells us about dissidents' predicament. They thought they were dealing with serious blows to party nomenclatura, but were only getting dust on its testicles while nomenclatura went on raping people. Can we not say exactly the same about Jon Stewart and Co.'s mockery of Trump? Do they not just dust his balls? At best, scratch them? And by the way, when I say, but I got him, his balls are full of dust, everybody who's seen the music video that incorporates this joke will know what I'm referring to. If you've not seen that, maybe I'll show it later, but you all definitely need to check it out. It's just look up the music video on YouTube. It's called The Perverted Dance. And then in parentheses, I think it's Cut the Balls. And it's a Slovenian actor doing a parody of Slavoj Žižek, and it's a fantastic music video. And of course, Slavoj gets a lot of backlash for using that joke, which is
Yes, but he's used it for a long time. That's an
time.
old joke of his.
Exactly. It's as old as the coffee cream one. The problem isn't that Trump is a clown. It's that there's a program behind his provocations, a method to his madness. Trump's and others' vulgar obscenities are part of their populist strategy to sell this program to ordinary people, a program which in time works against ordinary people. Lower taxes for the rich, less health care, fewer workers' protections. Unfortunately, people are ready to swallow many things if presented through obscene laughter or false solidarity. The ultimate irony behind Trump's project is that MAGA, Make America Great Again, effectively means its opposite, make America part of BRICS, BRICS, a local superpower interacting equally with other new local superpowers, Russia, India, China. An EU diplomat rightly pointed out that with Trump's victory, Europe was no longer America's fragile little sister. Will Europe find strength enough to oppose MAGA with something like MEGA, M-E-G-A, Make Europe Great Again, by resuscitating its radical emancipatory legacy?
Ooh, I have a lot I could say about that. I don't know how much more we should read. How much more do we have?
Okay, we're
Okay.
close. We're close.
We're close. Let's finish reading and then maybe come back to this, because I do think this is really the core point he has to make. And I think I could talk about it quite a bit.
Yeah, it's the title of the piece, really, from MAGA
Yeah,
to MEGA.
this is really, sometimes you have to read a while to find out what a piece is really about, but I think this is it.
Yeah. The lesson from Trump's victory contradicts what many liberal leftists advocated. Whatever remains of the left should rid itself of fear about losing centrist voters if perceived as too extremist. It should clearly distinguish itself from progressive liberal centrism and woke corporatism. Doing so brings risks. States could end up tripartite without big coalition possibilities, but taking this risk seems like our only way forward. Hegel wrote that through repetition, historical events assert necessity. When Napoleon lost in 1813, then returned from exile only to lose again at Waterloo, it became clear defeat wasn't contingent, but grounded within deeper historical necessity. The same goes for Trump. His first victory could still be attributed to tactical mistakes, but now that he won again, it should become clear that Trumpian populism expresses a historical necessity. Many commentators expect that Trump's reign will be marked by new shocking catastrophic events, but the worst option is that there will be no great shocks. Trump will try to finish the ongoing wars, enforcing peace in Ukraine, etc. The economy will remain stable and perhaps even bloom. Tensions will be attenuated, and life will go on. However, a whole series of federal and local measures will continuously undermine the existing liberal democratic social pact and change the basic texture that holds together the U.S., what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit. the set of unwritten customs and rules which concern politeness, truthfulness, social solidarity, women's rights, etc. This new world will appear as a new normality. And in this sense, Trump's reign may well bring about the end of the world as we know it, the end of what was most precious in our civilization. So let's conclude with a vulgar and cruel joke that perfectly renders our predicament. Oh shit, I forgot about this joke. I told this one to Anne like the next day. After his wife underwent a long and risky surgery, a husband approaches the doctor, who is his friend, and inquires about the outcome. The doctor begins, "Your wife survived. She will probably live longer than you, but there are some complications. She will no longer be able to control her anal muscles, so feces will continuously leak out. There will also be a continuous flow of bad-smelling yellow jelly from her vagina, so any sex is out. Plus, her mouth will malfunction and food will fall out of it." Noting the growing expression of worry and panic on the husband's face, the doctor taps him on the shoulder and smiles. "Don't worry, I'm just joking. Everything is okay. She died during the operation." If we replace the doctor with Trump, who promises to cure our democracy, this is how he might explain the outcome of his reign. Our democracy is well and alive. There are just some complications. We have to throw out millions of immigrants, limit abortion to make it de facto impossible, use the National Guard to crush protests. Don't worry, I was just joking. Democracy died during my reign.
Okay. So what is Žižek really after here? Žižek has a civilizational concern, the end of what was most precious in our civilization, ours being Western civilization, which is what he considers himself to be part of. Slovenia is part of the European Union, part of the West, right? Žižek became a huge household name in the West, and particularly in the English-speaking world. Žižek and Yugoslavia made the move into the West, right? So Western civilization is what he's concerned about. Now, his worry is that Western civilization is sliding and losing influence and strength to these other civilizational blocks, the BRICS, and that Western civilization is just going to be one civilization among many in the BRICS. So what he's really concerned about is multipolarity here.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying is he doesn't trust Trump to protect the position of Western civilization within the global order. And therefore, he wants the Europeans to step up and take on a larger role. The difficulty is that the Europeans have become economically significantly weaker over the last 15 years. They have become actually less capable of exercising independence in foreign policy from the United States. During the Iraq War, multiple European states defected, refused to send troops, refused to support the Bush administration, actively tried to oppose the Bush administration in the United Nations, right? If anything, the Europeans have very much lost ability to influence the direction of U.S. foreign policy. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is alleged to have been done by the Ukrainians, but there's, of course, enormous suspicion in Europe that the Americans either tacitly or explicitly okayed it. This made the Europeans quite dependent on North American energy, North American liquefied natural gas. It very much reduced the ability of the Europeans to have an independent foreign policy, independent economic policy. The euro during the euro crisis was very dependent on dollar swaps, very much showed that it was not capable of competing with the dollar or offering some alternative to the dollar. So there is a desire here on the part of Žižek to get the Europeans to pursue a more independent strategy. Really, the audience for this is the Europeans. The thing is, to get the Europeans to do this, the Europeans have to stop waiting for the Americans to solve their problems. If you want to make Euro-communism happen, if you want the Europeans to pursue their own policy, what would be the effect of this? Well, for the Europeans to do this, they would have to create a more federal, unitary European system. to be able to actually have an independent army, independent military, independent foreign policy, some alternative to NATO that would be European, right? So all of this would require consolidation of the European political system, which is currently and has been for a long time very haphazardly flung together because it piggybacks on the United States and on NATO, right? If you recall, during the Bretton Woods era, the European currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the euro was only introduced because Richard Nixon kicked them out of Bretton Woods because he destroyed the Bretton Woods system in 1971, right? So the Europeans, for a while, patched together various different currency arrangements. You know, first the European exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, and then the EU and the euro after that, because Nixon threw them out of the system by taking Bretton Woods apart in 71. So the Europeans do not integrate of their own accord. They do it in response to feeling othered by the Americans or feeling like the Americans aren't reliable. So if Žižek wants them to do Eurocommunism, he has to produce a crisis of confidence in the Americans. And for that reason, Žižek wildly exaggerates the significance of Trump in this piece to try to push the Europeans to start acting more independently of the United States. That is really the objective here.
Fascinating. I wouldn't have been able, I mean, okay, I guess on that third to last paragraph where he says, you know, it's really, the question is about mega as opposed to mega. I think, you know, it was coming through this the second time with you that I became aware of it. I'm going to reread that quote really quick. So how does he put it? He says, will Europe find strength enough to oppose mega with something like mega? Make Europe great again by resuscitating its radical emancipatory legacy? Yeah.
Yeah. And if you notice, Žižek, the three countries in BRICS that he chooses to list, Russia, India, China, right? He doesn't list Brazil and he doesn't list South Africa because those are the states that he's actually worried about. And Žižek is quite opposed to the Russians. He thinks that the Russian state is inherently opposed to the West and opposed to the possibility of socialist emancipation. So he's very committed to the Ukrainian conflict. He's very committed to Ukraine. He wants to see the Ukrainians get out from under the Russians and be brought into the West because he recognizes that Slovenia and many of these other states have grown enormously and enjoyed an enormous increase in standard of living by getting out from the Soviet sphere, out of the Russian sphere, and into the West. If you compare, say, Poland to Belarus, there's an enormous difference between Poland and Belarus now in terms of economy. It has nothing to do with the Poles being any better than the Belarusians. It has nothing at all to do with that and everything to do with integration into the West. Right? If you incentivize integration into the West with big economic carrots, these states will gradually Westernize and adopt a more Western position. Now, there have been hiccups with this in terms of Orban in Hungary and until recently in terms of the Polish government, which was recently voted out in favor of Tusk, who is a more liberal figure within Poland. But this is the principal horse that Žižek is riding. He wants to see these Eastern European states integrated into a European bloc, which has the strength to chart its own course free from the United States, which he regards as doomed.
And do you see this as just kind of like a not only hopeless, but probably not even preferable course of action? Or do you, I mean, where do you come from with all of this?
Well, I can remember, once upon a time when I was a young lad, thinking, wouldn't it be great if the Europeans would stand up to the Americans a bit more and maybe try to push for more of the world to move further to the left in terms of, say, healthcare policy? Isn't it wonderful that the Europeans are trying to transcend nation-state boundaries a little bit with a project which cuts across linguistic, cultural barriers? This is a way of thinking that I think a lot of people on the liberal left, or maybe left liberals in Europe, both of those groups have this kind of thinking about what the European Union ideally should be. At this stage, there's a lot of people in Europe who think that it needs to be reformed, perhaps even revolutionized from within. And you may have noticed that in the last 15 years or so, a number of these people have written books about how they'd like to see this happen, and they've tried to start political parties. Yanis Varoufakis in Greece, Mélenchon in France. There are a number of these different figures who want to see not necessarily the breakup of the European Union, but its transformation through the threat of breakup. This is something that I think a lot of people in Europe, if you're trying to look for a positive vision for Europe, where would you find it? It's quite difficult to find a positive vision for Europe in the last 15 years. Europe has declined significantly versus what it was when you and I were kids in terms of its standard of living and level of wealth relative to other states, right? Both China and India are catching up to Europe, and the United States is pulling away. The United States, the gap between the US and Europe has grown instead of shrunk. So this very much disturbs Europeans, but they're not sure how to move forward from here. Their institutions are not adequate to enable them to do even the milquetoast, build back better reinvestment that Biden did. European institutions can't summon the resources for even that. So they're looking at Biden like he was this incredible figure because their institutions are not even capable of doing that much.
Okay.
And they're going, how do we get institutions that are functional, that have state capacity again? This is the internal European discussion. But right now, for the most part, they've been playing defense against the right. And so Žižek is interpreting the European right populists as a genuine threat to Russianize Europe. And this in part comes from his generation. He comes from an era when there was a Cold War and there was this possibility that one side or the other might win. He's concerned that the West is in decline and that what will eventually happen is that the Russians will be able, or people who are fans of the Russians or who espouse a Russian style of rule, will be able to establish themselves in Europe and return Europe to the patchwork of warring nation states, each trapped in its own narrow jingoism. And that if the Americans decline and back out of Europe, that this will produce war and conflict and blood in Europe and a further decline in the standard of living. So he's very concerned about the Ukraine war, which he views as absolutely pivotal to the fate of Europe as a whole. He's very, very scared of the Russians. He views the European right as very much in league with the Russians. And this comes from the Cold War 20th century mentality. This is where the world he grew up in. I don't think it looks precisely like that. I could give you a set of arguments for interpreting it differently. And I think that's where he's coming from, though he doesn't make all of that explicit or lay all of that out.
No.
Having seen some of his other stuff and read some of his other stuff, though, and the degree to which he very much just absolutely hates Vladimir Putin, it's very clear he really cannot stand Putin. That would be my take on what he is trying to do there. In terms of, when someone like J.D. Vance talks about 1 million deportations, if you returned to the high Obama era deportation rate in 2009, 10, 11, 12, we used to deport 400,000 people a year in this country. In recent years, that number's been more like 200,000, if that. So when they say they want to deport 1 million people, they would accomplish that simply by returning the rate of deportation to the Obama level. Over the course of the term, they could deport well over 1 million people by just deporting the same number of people that Barack Obama deported every year. That would not be some kind of radical diminution of American democracy or any kind of radical change to the country. It would just be a return to Obama-era levels of deportation, which would be smaller as a percentage of the population than they would have been at the time that Obama was doing them, because the country's population was smaller in 2010, 2011, 2012 than it is now by some number of millions of people. But anyway, all of this is to say, I really think that what Trump is likely to do in Europe is very different from what Žižek is suggesting. I don't think that Trump is going to abandon NATO or get out. I don't think he's going to allow the Europeans to go and do their own thing. I think probably what he will do is continue the conflict in Ukraine. Despite saying that he would like to make peace, I think he will, after making some overtures, say that the Russians are unwilling to accept his generous terms and continue to arm the Ukrainians. It must be remembered, and we've discussed it on the show before, that Trump did arm the Ukrainians while he was president. And he did make threats to Vladimir Putin, and he did put submarines in the Black Sea, menacing the Russian coast. And I think what he will probably do is he will stop giving the Ukrainians money to have the Ukrainians buy our weapons with money we've given them. And he'll replace this with debt. So he'll give the Ukrainians weapons and then say the Ukrainians owe money in the future for the weapons they've received. So instead of giving the Ukrainians money and then having the Ukrainians give that money to American defense contractors, he will simply give them the weapons and then claim that they owe money to the United States or that they owe money to the IMF. And so then if Ukraine ever does manage to get into the West, it will be under this enormous debt cloud that will have been created, which will deprive the state completely of its autonomy and make it totally a slave to Western institutions. I think that's probably what Trump will do, which is not at all an abandonment of Europe or NATO. I think that Žižek is engaging in wishful thinking. He would like the United States to abandon Europe, because if the United States would abandon Europe, then Europe would have to develop its own course and it would have to become reinvigorated. I don't think that's going to happen at all, not even a little bit. And I think that a lot of people have engaged in wishful thinking about what the Trump administration is going to do for them. And even Žižek, in his condemnation of the Trump administration, is engaged in this wishful thinking in this article.
And I think that's what we should come back to on the B side. But I guess to wrap it up here on the A side, folks, I will just say that if Biden is the most leftist president since FDR, then that's even more reason to find a new framework. And that this framework of like, oh no, but like really left, like we really are left is like this master signifier. It's always like this, let's reconstitute an old European moment from history that we view favorably. And I just want to remind everybody that Europe is little more than a site for McDonald's and old museums. And I've been all over it. There's a lot of fine people in Europe, but it's also not what people make it out to be. It doesn't have the sort of, here's the thing it doesn't have. Boots on the ground in 149 countries. How about that? It doesn't have that. Like the empire has left the continent, right? And there's like this weird idea that power is still there. It's like, no, production's not there. The monopoly on force is not there. It's the idea that like Europe is going to save anybody, to me, just sounds outrageous. And it kind of highlights the point that when people start using left in this special non-American sense, they're usually like hailing to some bygone era when Europe really was the world leader, literally. And so I don't know.
Oh, and then they blew it up ultimately. You know, the Europeans blew themselves up. They were at no point engaged in some kind of sustainable long-term project, and they made all kinds of mistakes. That's why they've become what they are. But also it should be borne in mind that they don't make any babies. And then what they do is they admit a couple of states to the European Union every 5 or 10 years. That's what they used to do to get cheap laborers from Eastern Europe. And that's how they used to keep those Western European economies going. And then when they couldn't add any more states to the European Union because they ran out of states out there, they started taking in refugees and migrants from North Africa and the Middle East because they don't make enough babies and they need the population. Their social system is not actually adequate to support families, as much as people make it out as if it is the case. In point of fact, the European living standards and the European economies are not doing well enough to make people who are professionals feel like they can buy homes or have kids. Even though there's a lot more in the way of social programs in European countries than here, it's still the case that people in our social position who live in Europe feel they can't buy homes and feel they can't afford children and are putting off kids just as we're doing in the United States, indeed, even to an even greater degree than here. Because post-2008, post the Euro crisis, these countries are in deep, deep trouble. Their governments can't figure out how to spend money without having runs on their bonds. They can't figure out how to generate growth. Every time they try to make major investments, major tax cuts, whether they try a right-wing policy or a left-wing policy, any major attempt to regenerate growth leads to runs on their currency, runs on the bonds, and a huge mess. They're in deep shit. They really are. But this is why Žižek is engaging in a certain level of fanciful thinking about the renewed possibility. He's concerned about the fate of Europe. As well, he should be. Everybody in Europe should be concerned about it. And we should be thinking about what we can do, what can be done to make it better. But it's not going to start with having a fanciful notion of what Trump will do for you. Even if it's a negative fanciful notion in this case, that's not going to get us where we need to be.
Thank you. We'll be right back for the B side after this. And this will be like, for the people on the live side, this will be like a couple minutes. Like, take a few minutes, get some water, stretch, prepare yourselves. We're about to do a second side of this, and it's going to be a lot of fun. But I actually have to go and help my wife with something really quick. She needs me to send her a picture of the shopping list. And then I also have to like run outside and check on the cats and blah, 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 blah. So yeah, we'll be back. And I might, who knows, I might even play you all that music video I told you about. But first, don't forget to smash the like button, okay? All right.
What you taught I drew might with a
This, and the chances are you're enjoying it, which means you would maybe like other stuff that Theory Underground publishes. So make sure that you've subscribed and that you click the little bell. It turns out only 40% of people who subscribe click the little bell. But I think that at least 20% of the rest of y'all just don't realize how much pushing the bell really makes a difference, especially considering the fact that at TU, we tend to put stuff out without warning. You know, there's no schedule. This is coming from the space of my freedom. I just do this stuff when I can, and I don't want to live by a schedule because I'm sorry, I've got other things that are supposedly more important. All right. Well, with that said, there's also liking and commenting and subscribing. It obviously makes a difference. If you're one of those people who considers yourself a sort of recluse, well then maybe don't worry about the commenting, but you can at least click the like button. It does make a difference. Also, if you're listening to this on the podcast, please leave us a favorable review on your favorite platform. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory.
You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time, where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button, subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McCarrickers are doing, then the best way is to become a Tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a Tier 2 subscriber to... We interrupt this regularly scheduled PSA to show you the music video that was referred to on side A of this episode. And we'll be right back after it's complete with side B of this episode.
What's up with this music? I am a philosopher, I like to provoke. We live in perverted times, so let me tell you a perverted joke. A famous, dirty, horrible joke taking place in 15th century Russia. A farmer and his wife walk along a dusty country road. A Mongol warrior on horse stops and says, I'm gonna rape your wife and you should hold my testicles while I rape your wife so that they will not get dusty. When he raped his wife, the Mongol warrior went away. The farmer started to laugh and jump with joy. His wife said, hey, how can you be happy? I was just brutally raped. And she says, but I got him. His balls are full of dust. Well, in reality, we only dirty with us the balls of those in power. And now comes the dirty conclusion. The point is to cut them off. Now let me warn you, this isn't Macarena, not chicken dance, not a serege, not Gangnam Style and so on and so on. We stand no chance, there's no time for romance. It's time to dance, the perverted dance. Cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. We need to cut the balls of those in power. We need to cut the balls and our fishes won't be sour. Just cut the balls, make them become Niagara Falls. Cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. We need to cut the balls of those in power. We need to cut the balls, we can train with cauliflower. Just cut the balls, make them become Niagara Falls. Oh my god, why am I doing this singing, dancing? I feel like the disgusting guy from Canada, Justin Bieber. So, the problem with capitalism is that it's in a crisis from its very beginning. From somewhere, I would say, late 18th century, there are prophets who claim capitalism is nearing its end. It's like a stupid bird phoenix. The more you know, it returns. I got hungry. Let's grab something to eat. What? No meat? Only for vegetarians? Degenerates, they'll all soon turn into monkeys. I don't say, let's do nothing. I say, sometimes doing nothing is the most violent thing to do. So cut the balls. Just cut the balls. And racism is also a problem. So be like Kung Fu Panda. Be white, black, Asian, and cut the balls. Just cut the balls. They call me the Borat of philosophy, the Max Weber and the Elvis of cultural theory. Cut the crap and cut the balls. Just cut the balls. Hey, I am Slavoj Žižek. No, I am Slavoj Žižek. No, I am Slavoj Žižek. Whatever, let's all be Slavoj Žižek. Grab and pull the imaginary balls from the sky. Cut through the air and say bye bye bye. Let's join together, let's fall in trance. Let's dance the perverted dance. Cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. We need to cut the balls of those in power. We need to cut the balls and then make the bloody shower. Just cut the balls, make them become Niagara Falls. Cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. We need to cut the balls of those in power. We need to cut the balls, let them face the final hour. Just cut the balls, make them become Niagara Falls. Cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. We need to cut the balls of those in power. We need to cut the balls, we need to cut the balls. Just cut the balls, make them become Niagara Falls. This stupid repetitive mechanic music, stop it. Thank you very much. The problem is maybe not the big act cut the balls, but you make small changes and all of a sudden balls are no longer there. Those in power look down and say, oh, where are my balls? And suddenly their voices get higher and so on and so on and so on. I stand by my joke. The structure of a joke is that this so-called progressive intellectual, in order to score his small narcissistic point, oh, I just said the balls, totally ignores the suffering there, and that's the whole point of the joke. So cut the balls. We need to cut the balls.
There we have it. We did it, everybody. If you go ahead and let us know in the chat if you already knew about this this music video. Benjamin, you've heard this before?
Yeah, that's a classic.
Yeah, it's a classic that we actually, Mikey and I asked Slavoj Žižek about what he thought of it when we first met him. And the video of us asking him that question is actually somewhere on the internet. You can find him responding to it. The short version is he doesn't think that this was his enemies trying to hurt him, even though it's a joke that people often use against him. And he says, I wasn't hurt by it, but also he can't stand to watch it because he can't stand to watch himself. He's still never even seen himself in his own documentaries. He says, he's like, I hate myself so much. He says that in response to our question. And it's because of his mannerisms and his whole thing that is so endearing to some of us. He doesn't like it. And so people who feel so put off by Slavoj's mannerisms and whatnot, just know you agree with him. He agrees with you. He hates that too. But, for those of us who dig it, it's kind of what makes it It makes his whole persona so appealing. But we're back, folks. Great to see you all. Several people saying first time. Those several people being Trevor. Great to have you, Trevor. Looks like we've got over 100 people here right now. I'm about to hit record, and we'll get going with the B-side. I don't normally chop it up, but there was so much stuff in between the two, I decided to make 2 discrete episodes. So, yeah, we're going to... I think the last thing I need to do before I hit record, though, is just change the title of the live stream, since we're officially done with what Žižek said about Biden. What would we call this, Benjamin?
Well, good question, Dave.
Something like, what could Trump do? Like
yeah, what could Trump do?
What could
Republican dreams
do? And Democrat fears.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, we should say Republic. No, we got to put Project 2025 in there. That's everybody's talking about that right now. So
yes, Project 2025. Can it happen?
Project 2025. What is it, and can it happen? Why left episode? Oh, this is said episode 7. Is this is episode 7? We've been going so hard. Side B, baby.
We haven't even touched the beginning of what we can do. There's so much
I know
that we can do.
We haven't even really gotten into theory. We've been focusing.
I haven't done this show since 2020. I have all kinds of pent up public commentary I've not been doing. So, yeah.
Let's do it. I'm going to hit go in 3, 2, 1. All right, everybody, and welcome to the B-side. Thank you to all of our paying subscribers over at Substack and the folks who are listening to this on platforms like Spotify who ran into a paywall and said, I don't care, I'll jump over it. And then you paid, and now you're here with us on the cool side of things. Or you're just one of those people who happened to drop into the live stream while we were recording it. Great to have you all here. George says, enjoying Dave and the other guy. That's Benjamin. Yeah. So many legitimation crises, says Graham Lean. So I guess I'll just ask you straightforwardly as I can here, Benjamin. What can Trump actually do? Republicans are hopeful. Democrats are terrified. Everybody's talking about Project 2025. Do you? Well, no, I don't. Outside of your take on that, what is Project 2025? Could we focus on that first?
Yeah. So Project 2025 is a great big Heritage Foundation set of proposals, and it touches on almost every issue under the sun. It's a kind of Heritage Foundation wish list of what are things that the next Republican administration could do in all of these different areas. Now, think tanks like the Heritage Foundation put out these kinds of things every election cycle. They like to think about what it is that we could get or could see from an administration. If you're in Heritage or if you've been around Heritage, they think a Republican administration is a potential opportunity. So they set their people hard at work coming up with different kinds of possible. They game every possibility, everything that they could potentially do in every different policy area, right? Now, some people look at this and go, oh my God, they plan to do all of these things. Well, no administration can do absolutely everything that's in a Heritage Foundation report or in any of the other reports that will be put out by other organizations like the American Enterprise Institute, right? Any of these groups that start thinking about what can we get from this administration, Brookings or what have you. Brookings is generally more Democrat leaning, but Center for American Progress, there are all these different think tanks and groups that do this kind of gaming out. What is it that we could propose or try to do? And generally, presidents will look at some of this stuff if they hire people who are from these think tanks, from the milieus surrounding these think tanks. If you were to take someone from Heritage who was involved in the report and hire them into the administration in a particular department, and that person had worked on the part of the report to do with that department that might suggest a sincere interest on the part of the administration in taking up that part of the report, right? But of course, in practice, there's limited political capital that new administrations have. Certainly in terms of legislation, they cannot pursue everything that's in these reports. They have to make decisions about what to prioritize. These decisions will often be made on the basis of what does the president and the president's team care most about? And how will this stuff go with the public? If you try to do stuff that the public really hates, then you're going to get thumped in the midterm. Presidents prefer not to get thumped in the midterm, because if you get thumped in the midterm, then you only really get 1 year where you can move any legislation. So in your opening year, it's unwise to take policy positions that will get you thumped in the midterm, because it will cut the legs out from your legislative agenda and reduce you only to the terrain of executive action, right? What happened in the first Trump administration? Well, Trump decided to prioritize two principal things. He prioritized tax cuts for the rich, which is something every Republican administration proposes and tries to do almost immediately, dating back to Reagan, right? Every Republican administration will go, okay, let's do what Reagan did and cut taxes for the rich. You might recall the Bush tax cuts. You might recall the Mitt Romney tax plan from 2012. What Trump did there was more or less in line with what Republican presidents typically do. The second thing in terms of legislative agenda was repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act. This proved unpopular. Once people actually started to get into what is the Republican plan and what would the consequences of the plan be, people became very upset. You also had some level of upset about the tax plan because, of course, Trump had said during the campaign he was going to raise taxes on himself, and that is not what the plan actually did. The plan actually cut taxes on the wealthiest, just like every other Republican tax plan. Nothing really exceptional about it. So those were the two priorities. And if you look at Trump's approval rating and his favorability rating, the period when he was pushing those two things was the period where he was the least popular at any point in the administration. That first year when he came out with those two things was actually the nadir of his popularity and led to a bad midterm result in 2018 when the squad politicians were elected. And some people naively thought, oh, this is the beginning of the left taking power within the legislature, which of course it wasn't, right? But why is it that people could entertain that fantasy? Because at that stage in late 2017 and 2018, the conversation had been mainly about taxes and healthcare. And these were issues where Trump was not popular. Now, gradually, the Democrats moved it and began instead talking about Russia and trying to suggest that the election had been interfered in and that Trump needed to be impeached. And as the focus went away from the policies, this is something Žižek talked about in that article, when you stop talking about what he's doing and you start doing the circus of everything else, then people start to identify with him as a persecuted figure. He looks credibly anti-establishment again because all the establishment people are opposing him as if he poses a grave threat to them. So the effect of this is to make him look like a credible champion of the people when he was just being treated as a regular Republican president who was doing regular Republican things. He was quite unpopular. He seemed like a very establishment, rich, nasty guy. And if you recall, in 2017, there was a brief period where the media said, well, he's the president. Now we have to give him a chance and we have to treat him like a regular president. That was actually the most effective way of opposing him that we saw at any point in terms of what the numbers actually show in terms of people's attitudes toward him. But what happened, of course, is that eventually they backed away from this. And there were all kinds of problems in the first year of the Trump administration. You might remember they cycled through all these different chiefs of staff. You had all of these people backdooring their way into meetings with Trump, going around the chief of staff, who was completely overwhelmed. You had members of the family serving as backdoor conduits. So you had no formal structure for who could get a meeting with the president and how it would work. And they flipped him out. They had loads of different people come in and out of the comms office, of all of these different offices. And you had leaks, tons and tons of leaks from the bureaucrats throughout the early part of the administration. So the sense was that it was total chaos. And really, by the 2018 midterm, they were already screwed. They lost the legislative majority that they had. And from that point forward, they were really fumbling around with executive orders trying to stay in the mix on the basis of that. And then when COVID hit, they really had no control over any of that. They were completely blindsided by it, and it terrified them. They became worried that the tariffs were going to be a problem in terms of inflation, and they backed away from those tariffs. That was really the last thing he tried to do that was significant, because he could do that with executive action. The president has a unilateral right to impose tariffs, but that right can be circumscribed by Congress. So if Congress doesn't like the tariffs, if the tariffs go too far, Congress can take away the president's right to tariff and through legislation remove the tariffs that have been imposed. That's something that the Senate, including Republicans in the Senate, people like Rand Paul, who are still sitting in the Senate, explicitly threaten to do because they believe in free trade. And there's still a significant number of people, even in the MAGA movement, who in principle believe in free trade. They have certain levels of reservation about trade with China, which they regard as an emerging threat, but they're committed to free trade in general and don't like tariffs on, say, allied states or potentially friendly states. Someone who might fit that description would be, say, Vivek Ramaswamy, who is currently one of the 4 finalists to potentially be named as a Secretary of State nominee. So there's still a lot of internecine stuff going on. I mean, really, in the first Trump administration, Jared and Ivanka played an incredibly important role because they had a direct line to Trump throughout the administration, and many of the competing power bases in the administration expressed frustration to journalists and people writing tell-all books about Jared and Ivanka going around the normal formal procedure and having this backdoor that was unaccountable that they couldn't figure out a way to interface with. They couldn't get into meetings on equal terms with Jared and Ivanka. So there was this critique of nepotism, which came from people like Steve Bannon. It came from people like Reince Priebus. It came from insiders in the administration. This thought that the whole thing is too nepotistic. It's too much favorites and whoever he likes, that there was a court politics character to it. Now, the ostensible argument that people make is that he has learned things at his advanced age from the previous administration, and that this new administration will not have those kinds of divisions in it. That there will be an effort to get rid of the people who would pose a threat to the agenda, and that they'll be replaced with people who are more loyal to him. The difficulty is, and this was the case in the first administration, when he appointed outsiders, the outsiders struggled to manage their departments, were consistently leaked against by their underlings, and had all sorts of disorder and chaos because they were not experienced with government, right? And then when he would try to get people who knew what they were doing, those people were not loyal to him and would try to often even deprive him of information to back him into doing things that he didn't want to do. And you can actually find instances of people in the first administration taking documents off his desk or hiding them so as to prevent him from reading certain things or interacting with certain things. So there's a deep suspicion of the people with longstanding expertise in the government, because these people are not loyal. But at the same time, the people without this longstanding experience, who are genuine outsiders, often do not know how to do the job. And this has been the problem for Trump, and there isn't really an easy way of trying to get around this. People say, well, what's needed is ideological purity or loyalty on the part of the people who are appointed, and then he'd be able to do all of the things. The problem is that most of the people who are loyal are not competent, and most of the people who are competent are not loyal. And that problem was the consistent problem last time, and it will very likely be the same problem again this time. Now, the one thing that's in Project 2025 that you would not find in previous iterations of that document or in some of the other documents that float around is this idea that he needs to be able to fire bureaucrats. He needs to be able to fire civil servants to get more control over the departments so that they can't leak against the people he appoints, and they have more, and they can't thwart the things that the department heads are trying to do. Now, if they are to have any level of success, I think that's the part of Project 2025 that's really worth watching. Is he actually able to do some level of purging of the civil service? Is he able to politicize the civil service and make the civil service answerable to the elected executive, to use the kind of language that they would use? From their point of view, the bureaucracy has become unaccountable to the democratic public, because the bureaucracy is full of career civil servants who are politically untouchable. So they think that this impersonal bureaucracy is running the country and it's preventing the electoral procedures from enabling our elected officials to govern. weakening Congress and the presidency. And that Trump's role, they imagine, is to repoliticize these parts of the state and make them answerable to the people by making them answerable to the elected officials. Now, conversely, the Democrats' feeling, of course, is that these people have these jobs because they've passed competency exams. And therefore, that competency should be respected, and elected politicians should listen to and potentially defer to these technocrats on the basis of their technical expertise. And if they don't do this, it's an attack on science and knowledge and an attempt to govern based on arbitrary whims and fiction and misinformation and bad epistemology and so on and so forth. So a lot of this has to do with, what do you view the bureaucracy to be? Is it a store of genuine knowledge? It comes from people who have university degrees, a lot of experience in particular fields, or is this something that has a logic of its own accord, which creates problems that only it can solve, is a source of corruption, obstructs the agenda of elected officials, and functions as a deep state running the country, or a fourth branch of government, as Vivek Ramaswamy likes to say, running the country independently and separately of the rest of the government. This is really the interesting debate that goes on around this administration. And I think it's really where the media is. Most of the other stuff that people talk about, most of the other issues people are concerned about, there's a pretty simple story you can tell about what's going to happen. But this question of what's going to happen with the bureaucrats is the question that I don't have a straightforward answer to. I can't tell you for sure that he is or isn't going to succeed at doing some level of civil service reform. And I think it probably will be the key priority that the administration will have that will differentiate it. But will it succeed? I'm not sure. And also, it could look like it's succeeding and still fail, and that they could fire people, but replace them with other people who are actually not any different from the people they fired. And the intelligence services could try to ensure that that happens, perhaps by placing people in these offices and having them pretend to be MAGA people when in fact they're not.
So what about having all three branches of government red? What does that change this time around?
Well, they had all three branches of government before. In the early years of the first Trump administration, they had good numbers in Congress, and they had a court majority. That court majority is bigger now, and I think their position in the Senate is perhaps slightly stronger, although I'd have to look up the number. Please don't hold me to it. But I don't think that there's any wild difference at this point. 54 senators is not 60 plus. It's not a filibuster-proof majority. It's not an overwhelming majority. And you'll also find that many of those senators have been around a long time. Many of them predate Trump. Many of them have publicly opposed Trump in the past. You can't assume that they're going to back Trump just because they've said pro-Trump things. Often they do that to win elections. But they have, and they will try to tactically vote with the president as often as possible so they can't be accused of being rhinos. But that doesn't mean they're not rhinos. Rhinos are quite good at hiding. If you talk to the Trump base, they hate the rhinos because the rhinos are constantly getting away with blocking their agenda. And this happens all the time. A classic example would be McCain thumbing down the ACA replacement. But it's not just John McCain. There's loads of people in the Senate who would have been the one to vote it down if John McCain had not been willing to vote it down. There's a lot of people in the Republican caucus who thought that actually going through with repeal and replace would be very bad because it would result in millions of people all of a sudden losing their health care and produce a total electoral wipeout. It's not as if nobody in the Republican Party has electoral instincts. These people all want to keep their jobs, guys. So the stuff that's overwhelmingly unpopular with the public, they are highly unlikely to do because that would be extremely politically counterproductive for them. These people want to be president someday. They do not want to be associated with extraordinarily unpopular shit. So you got to bear in mind, each of these people has ambitions of their own. They have a vision of where they're at in their career. Every senator, every member of Congress has this narrative about who they are. In their mind, they're the only person who is them, right? In their mind, they're the protagonist of the story of the United States. The people who run for office and win, many of them are extraordinarily self-obsessed people who think that they're the answer to all the problems of the country. And for this reason, they are very reluctant to do anything that destroys their careers if they can possibly avoid it. And many of them will continue running for office in denial that their careers have already been destroyed, hoping that at some point things change and that new possibilities open back up for them. Think of Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. These are people who were totally humiliated in front of the whole country during 2016. They're never going to be president, but they can't accept this. And they've continued on with their political careers, even though they are absolutely not going to get any further than they've gotten. And at this point, only stand to potentially lose ground. They're still thinking, oh, maybe if we talk the right way, Trump will put us in the administration. Rubio is on the list of potential finalists for Secretary of State. He's thinking maybe after all of these years, even though I have tiny hands and I flail my water bottle around, maybe I'll get in. I very much doubt it. I don't think Trump wants his Secretary of State being that guy, but we'll find out.
We'll see.
I also don't think someone like Marco Rubio is likely to be loyal to the administration because Marco Rubio is really a Jeb Bush Republican. And yet he's being seriously considered for that post. There's going to be a lot of infighting, as there almost always is in administrations. You have to be very, very good at running a cabinet to prevent infighting from occurring. It occurs in almost every administration. People will invoke Lincoln and the Team of Rivals book that came out 20 years ago and go, oh, it's good to have disagreement. Only if you know how to manage it. And a lot of these guys, they have no clue how to manage it.
Trevor says, don't forget Debbie Wasserman Schultz's embarrassment in 2016. She's still in Congress with no shame. I don't think the comparison stands, right? Because we're talking about these guys' real shot at becoming president. That's
well, I think the comparison stands because Wasserman Schultz got an enormous amount of negative criticism from the left and from the base of the party, but it didn't prevent her from continuing on with her career. And she has continued on with it, even though there's a lot of older Bernie people who absolutely loathe her and will loathe her for all eternity. It hasn't stopped her from pressing on. These people will often press on and hope that eventually something will happen that will allow them to come back. After all, Richard Nixon came back, so why not them?
Right.
Tan, rested, and ready, now more than ever.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the quote. My computer's doing a search right now. I have an image of her, of Wasserman Schultz, and then the quote about the superdelegates over it, like like that viral one about how the superdelegates were made to keep popular candidates and activists out of the party. Back in the day, I had put that quote over her face, and by the way, a close up on her face is a truly terrifying thing. She's like, I mean, I'm not going to say it's unique for someone of her class, but she looks crazy. She looks crazy and scary. But Debbie Wasserman Schultz, what else did she do? Wasn't she one of the senators who was behind, were there like 13 or 14 who found out about COVID ahead of time, and so then they switched their stocks around? It was like insider trading or something.
Oh,
Wasn't she one of them?
I couldn't tell you exactly which people individually were involved with that.
Yeah, I think she might have been one of them. Anyway.
She's not in the Senate. She's in Congress.
Oh, see.
The reason that people remember her is that she was chair of the DNC for a stretch. And it was in that capacity that she really alienated people, because it was felt that she was operating the DNC in a nakedly unfair way.
Which she was. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. See, my memory about all of this is all very, very hazy. I've been disgusted and not looked back, and this is all kind of forcing me back into it. This is the, on the B side, it's usually supposed to be me torturing Studebaker, but in this case, I think it might be a little bit of the other side, but I want to try to pin you down on something though. Maybe we can make this a little interesting. Are you saying Trump will do or cannot do anything positive? Or do you, I should reframe that. It sounds like the way that you're talking about this is you're still trying to talk down the Democrat who's worried that so much stuff will happen, in 2025, which is fine, of course. But also, we have people listening who are like, yeah, there's things that I don't like about him, but at the end of the day, he's going to do some positive things. I'll use Rachel Haywire at Alt Culture from Substack. We had her on a couple months ago. She considers herself MAGA, though she's not conservative. She says she's just like an individualist, kind of vitalist, and there's things that are good about the MAGA movement for people of her tendencies. Well, she tweeted after the election results were in, there was no way I was going to be able to sleep like this. Who was I kidding? I'm crying with relief. Elon was fighting evil. Trump also won in 2020. They tried to kill him. Nothing he did as a person was worse than what happened to our country under Biden. Now, of course, just going with that, we're saying nothing worse could happen than what happened under Biden. But also this kind of like crying with relief reaction. I want to kind of hone in on that. Elon was fighting evil. They tried to kill Trump. Like, it's sort of like he's a heroic figure. To the person who's coming from that standpoint, and we do have a handful of them here in the audience right now, do you really think that there's nothing positive that will come for Trump supporters in terms of the interests that Trump supporters have?
Well, it depends on what you care about. If for you would consider it an accomplishment to get the deportation rate doubled from 200,000 to 400,000 per year, I think that might happen. If you would consider an accomplishment to get taxes cut on rich people and small business owners, I think that's likely to happen. If you would consider an accomplishment to get some of the bureaucrats fired, perhaps in certain departments, I think that's likely to happen. At least, it has some chance of happening. I think if you're looking for him to stop the Ukraine war, I don't think that that's going to happen. I think if you're looking for him to stop the Israel-Palestinian conflict, I don't think that's happening either. If you are talking about the economy as a whole, what I would point out, back in 2020, I was on a series of shows where I said to people that if you're on the left and you are supporting Biden, you're doing something very foolish, because this COVID pandemic and the policies associated with it that Trump had already committed to doing in terms of the Paycheck Protection Act, in terms of writing Americans the checks, in terms of trying to keep the economy running during and through the lockdown, these were going to have enormously negative consequences for the economy over the course of the next 4 years. And if a Democrat wins, then the left, because the left is associated with the Democrats, will be blamed for the results of these policies. If you really look at what the Biden policies are, they are a continuation of Trump's policies for managing the consequences of the pandemic. Now, the question that was being asked in the first year of the Biden administration, talking 2021 here, is how long do you continue these policies and how much further aid do you provide? Biden gradually wound down and ended the policies that Trump created to give people assistance. There was some debate about how quickly to do that. And the substance of the difference is that perhaps if Trump were in office, the policies might have ended a little bit quicker. Maybe there would have been a faster reduction in expenditures in the 2021 fiscal year. And that might have produced a slightly lower inflation rate in, say, 2022. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that it's easy for the Republicans when they're in opposition to call for winding down those programs. But if you're in office in 2021 and you're getting ready to head into the 2022 midterm elections, you might be quite skittish about ending, say, the unemployment assistance payments. You might be skittish about not doing another round of the Paycheck Protection Program, which, by the way, helped a lot of small businesses stay open. And both Trump and Biden were firmly committed to it. You might be wary about cutting the legs out from infrastructure spending. And you might bear in mind that Trump also proposed to do a large amount of infrastructure spending if he got back in. Now, the model for where the spending was to be done was different. So if you look at the Trump plan, it included a lot more conventional infrastructure spending, hard infrastructure spending on things like highways, railways, bridges. The Biden plan had more climate components to it. And for that reason, Trump supporters might say that they would prefer an infrastructure plan that comes from Trump rather than the one that eventually came from Biden. But you have to bear in mind that Trump was never able to generate enough support in Congress to pass the infrastructure plan that he had tried to pass every year from the moment he came into office. So it might not have been the case that Trump would have been able to do the infrastructure spending in 2021 had he been there. It's not clear that that would have taken place, in part because there were major divisions between the Republicans and Democrats over how to fund the infrastructure spending. The Republicans in Congress were not willing to put up the money and wanted instead to try to arrange for private companies to do it by incentivizing them with tax breaks and subsidies. The Democrats wanted to spend the money straight up. Because Trump was not willing to pass an infrastructure bill based on the Democrats' model, he wasn't able to get the votes because, of course, the Democrats would not vote for a bill which was a bunch of tax giveaways to companies. So you got into a position where he couldn't pass an infrastructure bill on either model, and the infrastructure in the country was just rotting and nothing was being done about it. So Biden was able to do some infrastructure spending, although a much smaller percentage of it was hard infrastructure than Trump had called for. And one of the consequences of this is that there's still a lot of rotting infrastructure. If you look at what the American Society of Civil Engineers asked for at the start of the Trump term, they were asking for an enormous amount of new infrastructure spending. And we really got only a very, very small amount, only maybe 20% of what they were asking for in the Biden bill, especially when you look at hard infrastructure spending as opposed to the other stuff that they spent on. It's really a very small amount. Nevertheless, the Europeans don't pay attention to these details, and they act like Joe Biden did an incredible industrial policy and flooded the world with infrastructure spending, in part because also they take the climate stuff incredibly seriously. So they view that as very hard infrastructure spending. And of course, Republicans don't think of it that way. They think of that stuff as flimsy giveaways to the green people, right? So, you know, there's some debate there about what can happen and about what did happen. But I would say, you know, it's not at all clear to me that there would not have been a period of inflation if Trump had won in 2020. Indeed, I think it probably would have been, you know, reasonably similar, maybe a point or two lower, perhaps, depending on, you know, if you don't do any of the infrastructure spending, but that's going to look like a failure to people, you know, then you would not have as much state spending going into that cycle. But if you don't do any infrastructure spending, then the country would not have been physically rebuilt to any degree, even, you know, in the pitiful degree to which Biden rebuilt it. So I think that, you know, would that have been better? You know, from the point of view of just having a functional economy? I don't know. I don't know if, you know, inflation at 2 points lower with no infrastructure spending would have been better. And, you know, maybe he would have done the infrastructure spending. Maybe he would have put together that coalition. But then I think the inflation rate would probably have been pretty similar to what it was. We can, it's counterfactuals, and we can go around and around on exactly what would have occurred. But I think the differences are much smaller than people really realize. And a lot of the industrial policy of the Biden administration has been done through military aid to Ukraine, something that it's not clear that the Republicans want to see continue, but I think it probably will continue. I think Trump probably will continue to make weapons for the Ukrainians. And you can see this in the language that's coming out of the defense contractors. They're saying to their stockholders and to their employees that it doesn't matter who wins, they expect to do equally well. Well, how can that be? Right now, companies like Anduril are building munitions factories to make conventional weapons to go to Ukraine. If they're going to do equally well, then they must expect that those weapons will still go to Ukraine. I think that really, and I mentioned this in the A side, the thing that's most likely to happen is that Trump starts indebting the Ukrainians for the weapons, as opposed to just giving them money and allowing them to purchase them without any debt, which is a difference in policy, but it's not really the peace plan that I think a lot of people would like to see. But of course, the Russians will be blamed in any event for the failure to conclude negotiations. And think about it. If Trump goes, I can't work with Vladimir Putin, he's trying to menace my allied state. The Democrat talking point of Trump is really in bed with the Russians would be heavily undermined by him coming out heavily in favor of Ukraine, saying that negotiations with Putin had collapsed because Putin is intransigent. And if you were trying at the level of the state to generate support for the Ukraine conflict, what better way to do it than to have Donald Trump say, you have no choice but to continue to fight over there. We have no choice but to continue to arm them. If he says that, many more people in the country will believe it. And I think it would be the easiest possible way to continue that war indefinitely would be to have Donald Trump endorse its continuation. And they will be working hard to get that to happen.
Amazing. So I'm going to hit my button there.
Amazing.
Now I've got two kind of directions I want to take this in terms of my lines of question for you. The first one is on the status of woke DEI, and sort of the Christopher Rufo analysis of what progressives have done with their long march through the institutions and the ways that that is obviously something that a lot of people involved in the MAGA movement are swept up with. But also, I would probably add, the go woke, go broke thing really is a sort of takeaway from the 10 million people not showing up for Democrats because, Trump gave Woman of the Year to Dylan Mulvaney last year, and they've been doubling down on these culture war issues. And, Kamala not going on Joe Rogan was a really big part of that, right? She could have gone on there. Instead, she acted a diva and said he would have to come to her and it couldn't be over an hour long, which is an obvious slap in the face considering the fact that everybody else goes on Rogan for 3 hours. This sort of culture war side of things, I know, is one that you don't tend to prioritize. You don't tend to take it too seriously. But at the level of parents trying to raise children in this country, being told or finding out that their child can get indoctrinated by gender ideology, that's a powerful motivator to abstain from supporting Democrats or to ultimately support someone who's saying that they will do something about it. So the kinds of bureaucrats that are getting fired is one of the big questions here. If it's the kind of bureaucrats that are advancing what's called gender ideology, then that's potentially going to make a big difference, not just at the level of like what Trump actually does, but also the symbolic import of this historically low turnout, right? Maybe you can't just shove whatever you want down everybody's throats and expect that they'll go along with it because the opposite side is Hitler. If Democrats register that idea, we can expect real cultural changes. No? You don't think so?
Ooh. I don't think we can chalk the lack of turnout up to the trans issue. I don't think that would be the principal reason why that happened, nor would I say Palestine, as many people on the left would say. Many people on the left would claim that Palestine's the reason for the lower turnout. I would say that it's just that Harris is very clearly to many people not going to do anything to make their lives better. When she's asked what will she do differently, she said nothing comes to mind. Biden was running on doing some stuff. There was stuff that he said he would do. There were people on the left who were telling people, we believe that we can make him the most progressive president in history. And some people were believing that because those people had created credibility over the years with the way that they had messaged and discussed political events in public. So I think that there was just much less enthusiasm for Harris. I think people recognized that all she was promising was not Trump. And I also think that many people recognize that she's not a very reliable person. She changes positions all the time. And she's also, and nobody likes this, but she's not a very competent or capable person. That's why the Biden administration marginalized her to the degree that it did. It's why she didn't pass the bar exam the first time she took it. I mean, those of us who are professionals, we know many people who are not very bright who have passed the bar exam. That's not that hard to do, guys. If you can't do that on the first try, if you are willing to sit the bar exam when you're not ready to pass it, you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Really, I would, the comparison point I like to make is to Dan Quayle. If you imagine if George H.W. Bush looked at the poll numbers in 1992 and said, geez, I'm getting thumped out here. Perot and Clinton are killing me. I'm going to step down. And then to make sure that my war chest can be transferred over without any legal challenges, I'm going to make Quayle the nominee. I don't think that would have saved him at all. I think it would have made the situation for the Republicans in 92 much worse. And I think that's more or less what happened here. But on the point, you had a question that was about the trans issue specifically, and I do want to answer that.
I said gender ideology, which is, I think, more expansive than just, say, the existence of trans people, as they will often frame it, considering the fact that Republicans have plenty of trans people on their side right now, prominent ones such as Buck Angel and Blair White or the Kardashian one. It's like there's obviously a turnout, but then of course I see lots of other detransitioners or heterodox trans people all over the internet right now, as well as obviously there's like a whole push of people saying I've left the plantation or I was never on it and we're not spoken for by these lobbies. We're not spoken for by these candidates. No, we are trans. Yes. And we exist, but we have no interest in your children or your children being taught this, or, children shouldn't be introspective about these kinds of issues. They should be off playing and not thinking about these kinds of things. Right. Like that is it's popular on the internet, and maybe it's a niche issue, but and I remember in our episode 3, Dave Snellgrove had said that these get blown out of proportion, but it's like when liberals and leftists and progressives and every bread tuber on the internet keeps saying that, oh, they can't stop talking about the trans issue. They can't stop talking about it. Wow, why can't Republicans stop talking about it? It's like, well, because you guys have changed the goalposts around again. This is not about bathrooms anymore. This is also about prisons and sports and children on hormone blockers, and that has nothing to do with trans people. So I just contest this being called the trans thing, because trans people are not the ones in the crosshairs so much as children and prisons and sports, right? Where people obviously have what I would call valid concerns, right? The kind of concerns that almost any parent would have.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not trying to make it out like it's an attack on trans people. I recognize that there are many nuances to this issue and many different, quite specific positions that people can have of many different types for many different reasons. I'm not trying to suggest that anyone who doesn't agree with the orthodoxy necessarily has an anti-trans position. Here's what I think is likely to happen. I think that probably the Trump administration will not pass legislation concerning this question. I think that would be a bit of a morass for them, given their priorities, to spend a lot of political capital on the issue in public. I do think there may be some executive action. I think there may be some interpretation of Title IX to try to incentivize or push universities to adopt policies that keep sports, women's sports teams reserved to people with double X chromosomes or something along those lines. I think that is reasonably likely, a certain amount of executive administration pushing, that may be part of this attempt to reform things like the Department of Education. I don't think they're going to get rid of these departments, but I do think that there may be some pushing. And I also think that the threat of firing large numbers of civil servants doesn't necessarily have to be carried out, provided that it has a disciplining effect on the civil service and makes the civil service more amenable to the people that Trump ultimately appoints to head these departments, which the Senate, by the way, has to confirm. He can't just appoint anyone he likes. The Senate will have to confirm them. But that's what I would be thinking is likely to happen. I could be surprised on this. They could decide that this is something they want to ride. Sometimes Republicans decide that these issues are politically expedient for them to prioritize. But I think we saw with the Ron DeSantis campaign that there are political limits to that. Now, Ron DeSantis did not get as far as many would have thought by explicitly centering culture war issues, in part because I think Ron DeSantis really did not understand the way in which Trump effectively uses those issues politically. Trump has a moderate position on social issues, and he opposes extreme positions,
Right.
both on both sides, and tries to frame himself as a compromise figure in the culture war. DeSantis misunderstood that because he's very out of touch with the ordinary American and took it as an anti-woke position. But I think we saw, and we talked a little bit about this in the recent episode about the role of race in the election. The Trump administration does not have a very radically anti-woke politics. Rather, it has a kind of different shade of woke. And I don't mean that to do any kind of pun with regard to skin color. I really just mean a slightly different, a variation on the theme that is in many ways more acceptable to people.
Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, what Žižek was also doing in that article we just read on the A side. Žižek was acting like Trump represents this extreme anti-woke position. And he even said that when extremes are winning, the winning approach for a Kamala wouldn't have been this sort of milquetoast non-committal thing. It would have been to be more extreme. And it sounds like, yeah, he's not seeing, and he was talking about being anti-abortion. It's like, yeah, no, Trump's been, I've always seen him as like a sort of Democrat, right? He's always been like this kind of pro-choice guy, and saying that, like, leave that to the states instantly. Like, there's Democrats are so easily triggered by this because, states' rights used to sort of, the Civil War was about states' rights. So they're triggered by that. But it's like, no, but there's also like a point to letting some things be decided from the state level. That doesn't make you anti abortion. It just makes you anti-federal interference on the issue.
And another thing that Trump did to the Republican platform is take out the opposition to gay marriage. That's something that changed just this cycle. Really, Trump is more liberal than the median 90s Democrat. His position on LGBT is more liberal than Bill Clinton's in the 90s. He's not, reinstating don't ask, don't tell. I really do think it's a moderate social issue position that he himself has. There are people in his coalition that have much more anti-woke, much more socially conservative positions, but these are not the people in decision-making spots. I mean, as Steve Bannon puts it, Trump is a moderate in the MAGA movement, a moderating force, and someone with more moderate politics than many of the other figures associated with that movement. But here I think Žižek in that piece really shows, and a lot of Europeans, they just don't dig into what are the internecine differences and conflicts within the American right. They don't have much tolerance for engaging with the American right, which they regard as not really worthy of their attention. And so they don't really dig into what are the different points of view and what are the different disagreements and tensions. And if you think of the right as a monolithic thing and as on all of the issues occupying the most extreme possible position and only making concessions when absolutely forced to, then you can have this narrative that, they have all three branches of government, therefore they'll do everything as extreme as possible. But this is not really how the right works. It's not this monolithic boogeyman where everybody within it has a bunch of 1880s positions on all social and cultural issues. Really, really not. I mean, by the way, in the 1880s, there were plenty of people with liberal positions. You'd have to go back an awfully long way to find anyone. I mean, really, we're not even talking about history. At the point at which people start mentioning things like Handmaid's Tale, they're talking about an arrangement which has never existed.
Right. Now, I want to bring up the other one. So I brought up the culture war. Now I'm going to share the screen here so that you're able to see these articles. Let's go here and move you over here. Bring the browser up. So my mom is very excited, and I think I guess I want to know how much of a right she has to be excited. The thing is there is something that happened, and it's kind of an indicator of some kind of of something. I don't want to say too much here. Let me set it up by saying, make America healthy again. This RFK kind of approach. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. The fact is, RFK was super anti-Trump, and then all of a sudden, he's on board. But of course, he's looking for a cabinet position. He's thinking that he's going to be able to advance his agenda, which is to undermine the pharmaceutical and psychiatric and big ag I want to say industries, but also bureaus, right? This is a big deal for RFK, and it's a reason why a lot of people were supporting him. I'm interested in how much of an impact he could actually have. I understand there's a lot of people who are just like, oh, why are you taking that seriously? He's just a kook. Well, he's I haven't done any research into RFK. You probably know more about him than I do. But what I can't, and everyone's going, oh, brainworm. I know that much. But what I do know, though, is that our health system is completely fucked. And it's not just on the side of people can't get good health coverage. There's also the side where we are being poisoned. Our food is garbage. There is negative zero nutritional value in a lot of our vegetables and fruits, not to mention, obviously, of course, diabetes-inducing cereals being sold to children. And, oh, there's vitamins in it. Oh, yay. When obviously that's one of the leading causes of death in our country. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes. These are huge issues, and they're issues that, in previous administrations, I think, it was the last time someone talked about stuff like this, it was Michelle Obama, right? But it's an important issue, and I'm interested in what role these bureaucracies have to play in this issue. But before, so there's the realpolitik and what we could actually expect to come from all of this. But then there's like the zeitgeist. And I just want to take a moment here to sort of steelman the zeitgeist to the best of my limited ability. So when my mom's excited, part of what she's excited about is this book and its popularity. It's called Good Energy by, I think this is like the whole freaking book in front of me. Casey Means, MD, with Callie Means. Okay, well, Casey and Callie Means wrote this book, Good Energy, The Surprising Connection Between Metabolism and Limitless Health. Well, Callie and Casey, you might have seen them on Tucker Carlson, How Big Pharma Keeps You Sick, and the Dark Truth About Ozempic and the Pill. This is a fascinating interview. If you want to, if you've got too much hatred for Tucker to be able to stomach this, well, then you could probably go see Callie and Casey Means all over the freaking place. They're on lots of platforms. It's not just Tucker, but this interview in particular was the one that my mom sent me. And so I did listen to it. And I remember thinking, I like a lot of what this guy is saying. Our food system has been fucked for a long time. If you read The Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry is very good on how the 1971 or 72 Farmers Bill told farmers, go big or go home. Really what they meant is go big or we will bankrupt you. You will not get the subsidies that you need to stay in business. And that this was because big agriculture was being turned into a weapon so that we could food dump into other economies, including the Mexican economy. So cheap overproduction of wheat and corn and soy made it so that we were able to dump unnaturally cheap, government stipend, cheap commodities into Mexico and places like it, making it so that the farmers there could not compete, making it so that they were put out of business, making it so that they had no other options. In a lot of cases, what you saw around this time was a huge rise in farmer suicides. The farmers who did go big had to import fossil fuel fertilizers. They call it fertilizer. It's really just Like, it's bullshit is what it is, because what's being grown there doesn't have nutrient density. Nutrient density has a lot to do with biodiversity. When you're monocropping stuff, you don't get biodiversity. So this approach that says we need to focus on the cause, not the effect, it's very important. Tucker here is really just asking him questions, barely talks at all. It's almost all Callie and Casey Means going off about how we don't get good energy from our food. This is the most important issue insofar as we care about some people in the population killing themselves, insofar as we care about some people in the population getting shot. We really need to care about the number 1, 2, and 3 killers, which are all coming down to autoimmune dysfunction and all of this caused by the fact that we do not have good energy, we have bad energy. Now, that's a lot of setup, and then I want to talk about the thing my mom's very excited about, but that was all just me kind of giving like the, this populist right kind of perspective has become the place where a lot of the permaculture and sustainable farming and local farmers market kind of approaches have been centering. And there's been some kind of a cultural realignment perhaps there. A lot of people that are hippies now hanging out with people like my mom, who's just always been a conservative, but she's a farmer. My mom will talk about things like sustainability now, when that used to be one of those red letter words that she would just not take very seriously. Now she's very into it because she's part of this changing, hey, we care about health of the environment side of the right. And so before I get into this specific piece of news, what do you think about all of this, Benjamin?
I think it has a lot to do with COVID. I think that COVID really undermined in general the American public's confidence in official science. And that made it very difficult to adjudicate arguments or disputes by appeal to scientific consensus in any domain of natural science. So I, as a political theorist, will not try to adjudicate any of the arguments about natural science. I'm not in position to do that. And it wouldn't be right of me to try to tell people what to think about natural science on the basis of stuff I haven't studied that I may have just read or heard from media. That stuff is not treated as credible by many people. And I want to assure anybody who's listening that if I give you a view, it's going to be based on my expertise. It's not going to be based on me blindly trusting somebody in some other discipline to tell me what to think about something. So in a case where I don't know, rather than tell you what I've heard the people in the academy say, I'll just suspend judgment. I don't know the details of all of this. And I couldn't be entirely sure, have I looked at how the research is generated? Have I looked at how people are producing it? Certainly I know that the universities take a lot of money from people with very deep pockets. I know that a lot of research is at this point funded with external backing from granting institutions that very often have a stake in what goes on. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad research, but it could be a factor. And I am not in position to tell you that I know one way or the other on all of that. So I'm not going to pass judgment on the natural science questions. I do think politically it has a lot to do with COVID and the way COVID made people feel about the quality of science in the country.
Yeah, I am also not qualified, but from my completely unqualified position, I'll just say the food is not nutrient dense. This seems to have something to it. I think there's a lot of people on both sides who will agree with that position. I want to see it addressed. And I guess the thing I want to see addressed more than that, though, which gets back to your point, Benjamin, is the science and messaging around science when it comes to nutrition is driving people mad. Eggs are bad for you. Nope, actually, it's just the whites. Nope, actually, it's the yolks. Actually, the egg is good for you. The whole thing is good for you. The messaging that we've received on so many things that should be empirically verifiable and beyond dispute is something that we are all confused about. And I think the book Disciplined Minds by Jeff Schmidt was really good for thinking about part of the issue there, which you're getting at with the large funding and the funding sources behind a lot of the studies that are being done.
Yeah, this confusion is at this point a political fact and one that has to be dealt with. It's not going to be dealt with by reprimanding people for believing the wrong sources. That's not going to be a solution to it. And it's not something I'm going to engage in or waste time trying to do myself. All of you out there who feel mistrust have reasons for feeling that way. And until those reasons are dealt with, you're going to feel the mistrust. Now, I'm certainly not going to try to scold you or shame you or try to make you think anything that you don't think, especially on something that I don't know very much about. This is very much outside of what I've studied.
Yep. So how many of you in the chat there, I'm curious, how many of you have seen Food Inc., Michael Pollan's famous documentary from back in, like, I don't know, 2012 or something? Benjamin, how about you? You seen that one?
No, I never watched Food Inc. I've seen it a few times sitting there in Netflix, but I haven't watched it.
Okay, so basically, this is where a guy named Joel Salatin first really breaks out onto the national stage. This documentary by Michael Pollan was based on a book, and it's a fantastic book for thinking about monoculture and Monsanto and kind of all of that stuff. But basically, the very short version of that documentary is to say, everything is corn. Corn is everything. Corn, corn, corn. Right? When did we make this shift to so much high fructose corn syrup being in all of our products? Well, has a lot to do with those kind of 1970s farmers bills that I was talking about, has to do with this move to big ag, has to do with the overproduction of corn and all of these things like this. But the point is like even cows are now corn, right? That's not what cows naturally and normally eat, but because of this overproduction of corn, it's almost all the cows themselves are eating. And this is you're supposed to be able to get a lot of nutrients from some beef, but when what those cows are eating are already like empty calories, and it's like bad corn, it makes for worse beef. This is the argument in Food Inc. Joel Salatin's put forward as like a lunatic farmer is kind of how he gets styled by some people, but he basically thinks the world can be fed by mid and small egg. And the fact is a lot of people are very excited by the kinds of stuff that he does. He doesn't just raise one kind of livestock. He doesn't just raise one crop. He does everything cyclically. He has it so that, the cows pave the way and then the chicken tractors come in behind them. And he's got like this kind of nice thing going, and he's got some basis in his, Aristotelian essentialism concerning like the functions and sort of purposes of different kinds of animals in nature. And like, chickens, part of their job is to break down these more complex things and then like add that back into the soil or whatever. I don't know. This is not my
part of the
area
trouble is
expertise.
that agriculture has become a smaller percentage of GDP over time, and food yields have increased and food prices have generally decreased globally versus, say, 100 years ago. And this makes it much harder to sustain large numbers of small farmers. So while I'm sure you could do a certain amount of land reform to get the size of the farms smaller than it currently is, I wouldn't try to frame that as a general solution for the economic problems people face. Agriculture is just not a large enough percentage of GDP to rectify economic inequality by putting people... Oh, I got you. There's an old position from 100 years ago called distributism that G.K. Chesterton and some of the Catholic theorists of that time were very interested in, that was framed around this idea that you could solve a lot of the social problems by divvying up land into smaller plots.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Back in the 20s, this still seemed to some people to be something you could do.
Interesting. No. So, I mean, I think that if there was like some kind of an alliance to be made with people of this position, part of the framing around it would probably have to be like, we actually need to decommodify healthy food, and we're going to need larger structural changes to protect people who are producing healthier food, and so I am interested in like the possibilities there. But what I'm trying to get at really quick here is just that Joel Salatin, actually, I'll read from the chat because we've got somebody who knows all about it here. He's very excited. Trevor said, Salatin wrote the book on small farms. I run a pastured poultry operation based off of his work. 500 laying hens, 2,500 broilers a year. That's awesome, Trevor. And yeah, I grew up on a small farm that also does this. I was one of the people who moves those chicken cages every morning. And so I know all about that life. He says it's a localism argument. I would argue like some kind of larger scale system has to be in place even to make that possible. Of course, someone like Joel Salatin's more libertarian, so he's not going to recognize those kinds of issues with capital. But it does produce arguably healthier food. Okay, and so anyway, the big news though is this right here. This is what got my mom so excited. Breaking: Joel Salatin appointed advisor to the Secretary for USDA. This came out on November 6, 2024. Breaking news for the ardent followers of the modern homesteading movement was announced late on Wednesday afternoon. Joel Salatin, the self-described Christian libertarian environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer, has received an appointment by Congressman Thomas Macy from Kentucky to be an advisor to the Secretary to the USDA, a key influence inside. Does it just cut off there? Yeah, well, a key influence inside. And then they go into it a little
inside
bit
the
more.
agency. It's down there. The rest of the story is below.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I didn't see this. Where
It picks up from I've been contacted by the Trump transition team to hold some sort of position within the USDA and have accepted one of the 6 advisor to the secretary spots. Yeah, see, 6 spots and advisor to the secretary. And then there are the undersecretaries, by the way. It's a large department. I wouldn't take this to be in and of itself necessarily very meaningful.
yeah.
Not in and of itself. You might subsequently read some stuff that would suggest a line of influence. It's possible that he could be influential. But when you have 6 advisors to a post that has not yet been filled, right? It's not clear that any one of those 6 will ultimately be very influential. And the 6, they might have different views. They might not all have the same view. Difficult question whether this would actually mean that much influence would be there.
Yeah,
It would be a quite different thing if he were appointed Secretary of Agriculture.
Right. Yeah, advisor to the Secretary is a much weaker position than God Emperor.
And there's 6 of those.
Yeah.
6 of those for this story. So I wouldn't get altogether carried away about something like that.
My mom,
there's a question about whether somebody like RFK can get confirmed. Will the Senate confirm him? I'm not sure they will. And one way that Trump could discharge his obligation to RFK would be to appoint him and then have the Senate not confirm him and then say, well, Bobby, I tried. Yeah, that's something that could happen. It is possible that he could get confirmed. And then, one question I have is this an issue in his mind with the corruption of the FDA, or it's underfunding, or both? Because you could fire and replace the FDA, but for one, would the people that you would hire, would they be competent to do the jobs, even if they're less corrupt? And then for 2, part of the trouble with the FDA is just that it's not capable of enforcing all of the existing rules due to its size. So, and then there's also the potential issue of you don't like the rules, you think the rules should be different. So if you want the rules to be different, what's going to be the process for changing those rules? Is it going to be legislation? Is it going to be just appointing people who interpret the rules differently? So a lot of different questions that come up on this issue that it's difficult to game plan, because something like this hasn't been tried in U.S. politics for a long time. If the Trump administration really does mean to unleash RFK and let him try this, they got to get him confirmed. Then they have to get people in the Department of Agriculture who are actually willing to do the things RFK wants to do. And then they need enough funding for that department to impose any new rules and to enforce, especially if he's going to have higher standards for food quality. They're going to need to get bigger which means they're going to need more money, which is going to require appropriation by Congress to increase the size of that department. Now, at a time when Trump is talking about tax cuts and about shrinking the administrative state, expanding it to enforce new health and safety and food quality and sustainability regulations, that could be tricky. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. You may see a situation where RFK is able to replace some people and impose some different rules, but lacks the capacity in the department to enforce the rules, especially if they're quite extensive in scale or in scope and very, very transformational or radical. It would be difficult to enforce them without more money. Usually, if you try to introduce a lot of new rules, you need cash to actually enforce them. It's been a long time since someone has tried to expand the regulatory state like that. And that is what that would involve. It would involve expanding it, similar to what was done when these organizations were created, way back when, during the progressive era under presidents like TR. That's expensive. They had to create the income tax to build up the regulatory state, as you might recall, to come up with the funding for all of these departments. They needed the income tax. And then the Supreme Court struck down the income tax, and then they imposed it through a constitutional amendment. It's a tricky thing, trying to increase the capacity of the state to regulate, especially at a time like this, when in so many other areas, the administration seems interested in reducing bureaucratic involvement in what goes on and in deregulating in areas where they feel regulations have been too extensive. I have a suspicion, I may be wrong, but I have a suspicion that Bobby was made certain promises to get him to drop out. That now that Bobby has dropped out, he doesn't have altogether a lot of leverage. Trump is a loyal guy. He doesn't want to openly screw Bobby, but there may be some way in which he can appear to be keeping his end of the bargain without actually putting Bobby in position to make all of these changes. The easiest way to do this would be to nominate him and then let the Senate vote him down.
So that's just a nice big wet blanket for you, Mom. I just want to say I am so sympathetic. I do hope that someday in our future, there will be changes that can make it so that people like you are able to do what you need to do with your farm, and that you will have less oppressive red tape put on you that was ultimately meant for much bigger operations, right? That she has to deal with crazy stuff that she shouldn't have to deal with on her 5 acres, and a lot of that comes from policies that were put through for much bigger farms. And I'm very
that kind of stuff, that something might happen with that, because anything that's deregulatory that reduces the enforcement needs allows them to save money. So that's much more likely to happen. But the stuff, the MAHA stuff, the health stuff, would require a stronger regulatory state that's more involved ultimately, because you'd have to make all of these big farmers follow these rules that they don't want to follow for improving the health quality of the food, insofar as that's what the regulations would in fact do. That seems tricky to me, given the objectives. But if you're just talking about, getting rid of some regulation, I mean, they might do that. That they might do.
And that could be a mixed bag, right? So we're nearing the point where we will close out here, folks. There's a couple things we'll each want to hit on as we close it out on this question of what could Trump do and Project 2025. I guess I spend so much time doing pretty much anything and everything other than looking into such questions, because I feel like I'm going crazy whenever I try to get to the bottom of any issue like this. To me, there's just been a lot of sensationalism and catastrophizing and, 2025, it's fascism. And I kind of just don't buy it. I think that I really appreciate Benjamin being here in a sort of sense as a kind of confirmation of my gut sense. It's like he's made his actual research. Why They can't really do major changes that have any sort of staying power. Whether you're on the left or the right, you've got a lot to be disappointed in for the rest of your life if you think that you're going to get major changes from the system. And that is because the way is ultimately shut, right? What would you want to say on that then? And is there anything else you want to get into here before we close out, Benjamin?
Yeah, it is very difficult for them to do altogether very much. They really don't have nearly as much dynamism or state capacity as some might like them to have. But, you know, I think it's not altogether unreasonable for you to not want to follow all of this. It's depressing and it's not very much fun. You know, and people like me ought to follow it so that people like, you know, you and maybe others don't have to if they don't want to. The issue is that because nobody trusts people like me to tell the truth anymore, because our disciplines, the credibility of our disciplines and our expertise has been shot. Now, if you try to look around for what's happening, you'll just find a bunch of sensationalist news stories that exaggerate and say all kinds of unreasonable things that you can't trust. So to just say to anybody out there who's thinking, well, how is it that you can read all of this stuff and try to make sense of it? What you really have to do is you got to think about these people as people. The people who are making these decisions are human beings. They've got interests, just like you or me. They want their careers to go well, just like you might, or somebody else you know might. So what do they need for their careers to go well? Well, they need votes. They need money. If they do things that deprive them of access to votes and money, what happens? They tend to lose. They're not competitive, right? So usually, either they will do stuff that gets them votes and money, or they will lose elections and be uncompetitive. Now, you will occasionally find instances where they will choose to lose elections because they don't want to do the things that would win them votes and money. Sometimes that does happen. These people do have principles. They do have values. They do have things they care about, and they will occasionally lose elections over them because they are human beings. But to really get to the bottom of what is somebody going to fight for and what are they not going to fight for, you got to know what they care about. And that requires, you know, following these people closely and not just treating them as images of the right or images of the left, which we treat blanketly as some kind of boogeyman object. You have to actually get to know these guys. And a lot of them are not altogether pleasant, and they're not altogether fun to get to know. But that is the work of trying to follow American politics. You know, what do these people actually believe?
Did you get the new edition of The Week yet?
Not yet. We have to save that one for next time. I'm sure it's going to be a riot when it comes. I can just imagine people at The Week, you know, tearing their hair out in misery over the election outcome and very much not even wanting to do the work of putting the new issue out. Many of them very clearly just couldn't stand Trump and very badly wanted Harris to win. The tone of many of the stories, the headlines, the ways they were organizing the news articles were giving away a lot of what they really think in recent months. So I'm sure it's a quite stressful time for people at The Week, and I hope that they feel better soon and send me a new issue so I can talk to you about it.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this component of the show here, guys. I mean, the fact is if you are tuning in, chances are you have not been reading The Week every week since you were wearing diapers like Benjamin apparently was. He's been doing it, and basically, yeah, it's like this zoomed out sort of what's going on at all of the mainstream outlets. What are they talking about? What is the discourse? And so I'm pretty excited to find out kind of what is the general reaction from the election results, and more importantly, your assessment of all of this.
I get it in print. It has to come in the post, in the mail. The mail truck comes, and then I get it with the physical pages, and I flip through it. And I go, oh, what will be good for Dave? And I act like a little old grandma, like my grandmother used to do. She used to call me on the phone and go, are you watching PBS? Because the King of Jordan is on Charlie Rose. And he seems like a bright and intelligent man. And then we would have conversations about it.
I can't wait for it. All right,
Old
everybody.
media, man.
Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Take care. And then for the people here on the live stream side still listening, the recording now is over. I just wanted to say, if you stick around, you're about to get relocated from this chat into a new live stream that will be run by Nance. Nance is kicking off a live stream right now. And as long as I can figure out what buttons to push, we're a little new to this, passing this hot potato like we're doing here. You'll all be there, and he will do something for an hour, and then there will be a discussion over at the Theory Underground subscribers Zoom call. That's something, Benjamin, you are of course invited to. Everybody here, as long as you are a subscriber at TU via the website, not anywhere else, you have to do it through the website, you will have access to that call. We will be talking about habitus and field and its relation to the mode of production, the horizon of possibilities, the relations of production. A couple of lectures that I did last week, some reflections on all of that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing people's feedback, and then we'll probably get a little deeper into the concepts. So, yeah, stoked to see you all there. Have fun with Nance. We're about to roll the commercial. Benjamin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure as always.